Settle in, this is a long one. It's everything you need to know about fighter jets. If you look closely at the nose of the Bell P-59 Air Comet, America's first fighter jet, you'll spot something baffling bolted to the front of it. A wooden propeller. Wooden propeller doesn't work, it is a fake one screwed on for the sole purpose of just fooling everybody watching it taxi on an airfield in 1942, making them think that it's just another piston engine fighter. I hope they found a way to make it spin. The Americans were so worried about Axis spies clocking their new jet that they dressed it up in propeller drag, like a celebrity in sunglasses and a baseball cap trying to slip out of a Los Angeles cafe. That, before we go any further, is your introduction to the world of fighter jets, a world where a global superpower bolted a fake mustache onto a revolutionary weapon and called it OPSEC. That's short for operational security, everybody. The story only gets strange from there. Within 2 years of that wooden prop charade, a British pilot would tip a German flying bomb out of the sky with his wingtip because his guns had jammed and he couldn't be bothered to let the thing reach London. A few years after that, an American Sabre pilot named Russell Brown would claim the first jet versus jet kill in history over the freezing skies of Korea, opening an entirely new category of warfare nobody had a manual for. By 1958, 4 little heat-seeking missiles called Sidewinders would shoot down 4 enemy MiGs in a single afternoon over the Taiwan Strait, the opening act of the air-to-air missile age. In 1976, a Soviet pilot called Viktor Belenko would casually defect by landing one of the most secret aircraft in the world, the MiG-25, on a civilian runway in Japan and hand the West a Christmas present wrapped in the flag of the Soviet Union. In 1982, Israeli pilots over Lebanon's Bekaa Valley would claim 88 Syrian jets in roughly a week, about 7 full fighter squadrons erased from the sky in the time it takes most of us to use up a loaf of bread. And in 1999, over Serbia, a stealth fighter that supposedly couldn't be seen by radar would become a smoking wreck in a Belgrade museum and stay there to this day. Somewhere in the middle of all that, a film called Top Gun arrived and convinced an entire generation that fighter pilots wore aviators in the shower, and that appropriate response to a near miss with a MiG was a beach volleyball montage.
Let's go!
Might not be appropriate, but it certainly is cool. United States Navy recruitment officers reported their phones ringing off the hook for weeks. But have you ever really stopped to think about how exactly the world got from canvas biplanes with machine guns bolted onto the cowling to a single aircraft that can spot another aircraft 100 miles away and kill it before the other pilot even knows it's being looked at? Or who actually invented the jet engine that made all of this possible, and why 2 different men in 2 different countries did it at almost exactly the same time without ever meeting? Or why, after all the money, all the secrecy, all the engineering, countries still spend $100 million per copy on these things? Well, you're in the right place, because this is everything you need to know about fighter jets. Time to scramble the squadron. I want to scream something about Goose right now.
You gotta let him go, sir.
Just before we continue, a quick word from our sponsor, Plord. And this thing on my phone is not a credit card. This is probably the one thing that has saved me the most unnecessary rework over the last few months. One thing I realized after doing this for a while is that a lot of mistakes don't happen because you completely misunderstood something. Usually, it's just a small detail you missed during a meeting or a call. Someone suggests a different direction for a channel, a deadline changes slightly, that sort of thing. You might think, oh, I'm not going to remember that. Oh no, but a week later you realize, well, fantastic. It's on the Plord. I started using the Plord Note Pro ages ago, and honestly, it's kind of like my fallback system for anything I don't want to rely on memory for. It's simple. You hit one button on the front, and there you go. You're ready to start recording a call on your phone, or honestly, mostly, I just use it for taking notes. Like, I'm in a meeting, I'm walking down the street, I'm just like, mumbling into my Plord like this. No apps to open, no notifications, no distraction in the middle of a conversation. Then afterwards it gets turned into a neat transcript with a clean summary and action points. It helps you catch the things that you would have otherwise missed. Plus it has AI built in, which is actually useful and practical. Those note summaries are very useful. You can also ask Plord about previous conversations, pull up decisions instantly, or even use some of the analysis tools to better understand the intent behind discussions and where conversations were actually going. I've also been using Plord Desktop more lately since most of my meetings happen on the computer. So when a meeting starts, it can automatically prompt recording and keep everything connected between mobile and desktop, which fits my workflow great. So yes, if you're constantly juggling meetings, projects, clients, or just too many conversations at once, this is probably worth looking into. There's a link below. I should also have a 10% discount code for it down there. They also offer a 30-day free return policy, so there's not really much risk if you want to try it. Thank you to Plord for sponsoring, and now back to today's episode. But let's start off with, what is a fighter jet? Now, before we get into the headline-grabbing dogfights and the ferry pilot defections, we need to nail down what exactly a fighter jet is, because the word fighter has been doing an enormous amount of heavy lifting for about 100 years now, and the modern category is broader than most people realize. In the strictest sense, a fighter aircraft is a military combat aircraft designed primarily for air-to-air combat, meaning its core job is to shoot down other aircraft and clear the sky of enemy ones. That is the spine of the definition, and it has barely changed since the First World War, when the first purpose-built fighters were essentially flying machine guns whose only mission was to kill the other side's flying machine guns. Everything else a modern fighter does, and believe me, they do a lot. You are going to find that out today, or maybe tomorrow, it depends how long it takes you to listen to this enormous video. Well, it's all built on top of that one stubborn purpose. Now, you might reasonably ask, why does this matter, given that today's fighters drop bombs, fire cruise missiles at ships, sniff out radar emissions, take reconnaissance photos, and occasionally double as flying communications nodes? The answer is that none of those secondary jobs work if you can't first survive an encounter with another aircraft trying to kill you. A bomber that gets shot down before it reaches its target is just an expensive way of donating aluminium to the enemy. A transport plane full of paratroopers is a flying coffin if the enemy controls the sky above the drop zone. The fighter exists so that everything else can exist. So, how does a fighter differ from its cousins in the military aviation family? So a bomber is built to carry weight a really long way and then drop it on something. Think of a removals lorry with wings. A transport hauls people and cargo. An attack aircraft like the famous A-10 Warhog is optimized for shooting at things on the ground, often slowly and at low altitude, which is really rather a different problem from shooting at things traveling 500 miles an hour 2 miles above you. An interceptor is a specialist subtype built for raw speed and climb rate to rush up and meet incoming bombers before they hit the homeland. And then there's the modern multi-role fighter, the F-16, the Rafale, the F-35, which tries... Whenever I read Rafale, for the longest time, I thought it was Raphael. People were so critical. I got it wrong. The F-35, which tries to be all of the above on the same airframe, with air-to-air missions still sitting at the top of the priority list when the missiles start flying. The phrase you'll often hear over and over in today's video is air superiority, and let's explain that in plain English rather than military speak jargon. If your side owns the sky over a battlefield, your tanks can move, your ships can sail, your troops can dig in, your supply convoys can drive, and your cities can sleep comfortably at night. If you lose the sky, every single one of those activities suddenly becomes rather lethal and expensive, and nobody sleeps very well. Colonel Zurab Ichniavili, a Georgian Air Force officer during the brief but brutal 2008 war with Russia, put the feeling about as well as anyone ever has. We had nothing to send up against them. It's a terrible feeling. The sky is theirs, and there's nothing you can do. That sentence is, in a single breath, the entire reason countries spend obscene sums on these aircraft. So, what makes a fighter jet mechanically? Well, you can boil it down to a recurring triad that we'll come back to throughout this episode. Speed, sensors, weapons, all three carried by a human pilot sitting at the top of a much larger support network of ground crew, mission planners, refueling tankers, and radar operators. The aircraft is the bit you see at air shows, but the system is what actually wins wars, and forgetting that distinction is how air forces have been embarrassed many times. So, how well does the combination work when it's actually in flight? Let's consider the F-15 Eagle, an American air superiority fighter that entered service in 1976. Across its operational life, with operators including the US, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Japan, the F-15 has racked up something in the order of 100+ confirmed air-to-air kills and 0 losses. That is a heavyweight boxer who has had 100 professional bouts and never once been knocked down, never once lost on points, never even had a draw. It is, as scorecards go, almost suspiciously good. Modern fighters routinely cruise at around 50,000 feet. That's about 1.7 times the height of Mount Everest, in air that is so thin the sky overhead turns a deep indigo and you can start to see the curvature of the Earth at the horizon. Their radars can pick out a target the size of a family car from over 100 miles away. Their missiles can hit a maneuvering aircraft from beyond visual range, meaning the loser of a dogfight often dies without ever seeing the winner. And the price tag, for one frontline example, all in, as we said, can comfortably exceed $100 million. So why spend that kind of money on a single aeroplane? Well, because as we just heard from the Colonel, if you lose the sky, everything else on your defense budget gets a lot more expensive very quickly. $100 million sounds insane until you compare it to the cost of a war where you couldn't fight back. 2 inventors, 1 revolution. To understand how we got from canvas biplanes to F-15s with perfect scorecards, we have to rewind to the late 1930s, when 2 engineers, 1 British, 1 German, who would never meet during the development of their work, were independently solving the same problem from opposite ends of Europe. The Briton was Frank Whittle, a Royal Air Force engineer with a working-class background, a chip on his shoulder about Air Ministry bureaucrats, and a conviction formed as early as 1929 that the piston engine had a ceiling and that the future of high-altitude flight belonged to something that he called the turbojet. The German? That was Hans von Ohain, a physicist and engineer working for the Heinkel Aircraft Company, who had arrived at the same fundamental idea. Burn fuel in a continuous stream, shove the hot exhaust out the back end, use the reaction to push the aircraft forward without ever reading a line of Whittle's patents. But 2 men in 2 countries cracked the same problem at almost the same time with no shared blueprint between them is one of those moments in engineering history where you can almost hear the universe muttering, "Must have been about time for this, eh?" Whittle filed his first turbojet patent in 1930, von Ohain filed his in 1936. Neither knew the other existed. Von Ohain, though, later with the patent, but he got in the air first. On the 27th of August 1939, 5 days before Germany invaded Poland, a small, stubby aircraft called the Heinkel HE-178 lifted off from Marionette Airfield in northern Germany with test pilot Erich Warsitz at the controls. It flew for just 10 minutes, and it became the first aircraft in history to fly under turbojet power alone. The jet age, as practical propulsion, had begun, and almost no one outside a small circle of Heinkel engineers knew about it. Britain caught up 21 months later. On the 15th of May, my birthday, 1941, not my birth year, at RAF Cranwell, a sleek little experimental aircraft called the Gloucester E-2839, powered by Whittle's W1 engine, took to the air for its maiden flight. It was Britain's first jet aircraft, and it vindicated more than a decade of Whittle's increasingly desperate lobbying of an air ministry that had spent most of the 1930s treating him like a slightly embarrassing eccentric who wouldn't stop bothering them about combustion chambers. Once the thing actually flew, funding of course appeared, a proper workshop started, and an entire test program appeared with it. This is somewhat the established and reliable order of operations for the British military, which is to say, do nothing for a decade and then panic and do a lot. What's strange about these early jets, looking back, is how small and tentative they were. The HE-178 was barely larger than a sports car with wings. The E-2839 looked like something a clever sixth former might build in a very well-equipped shed. Neither carried weapons, neither broke any speed records that a top-end Spitfire couldn't match. To a casual observer in 1941, the jet revolution looked a bit like an expensive sideshow. But the engineers knew what they were looking at. A piston engine driving a propeller has a hard physical limit. Once the propeller tips approach the speed of sound, the whole thing becomes spectacularly inefficient, and you can't make the aircraft go meaningfully faster no matter how much horsepower you throw at it. The jet engine simply does not care about that shit. You push more fuel in, you get more thrust out, you climb higher, and you fly faster. The ceiling that had defined every fighter of the 1930s had just been lifted, and somewhere in a Heinkel hangar and a Gloucester works, 2 men had handed the world's air forces the future. The engine existed. Now someone, somewhere, of course, was going to turn that into a weapon. And the country furthest along that path in 1939 was, ominously, the one that had just rolled tanks into Poland starting World War II. Me-262 meets Meteor. Now, if you want a date for when the jet stopped being a curiosity and started being a bit of a problem, you can try July the 18th, 1942. That is the day that Messerschmitt, the Me-262, a twin-engined, swept-wing, shark-shaped predator of an aircraft, made its first flight under jet power alone at Leipheim Airfield in Bavaria. The Me-262 was roughly 120 miles an hour faster than the best Allied fighters of its day, which in air combat terms is the difference between catching your prey and watching it disappear over the horizon. It would go on to become the world's first operational jet fighter. And on the 26th of July 1944, a Luftwaffe pilot named Alfred Schreiber, flying an Me-262, intercepted a high-altitude British Mosquito reconnaissance aircraft over Bavaria and damaged it badly enough that it crashed on landing. That, depending on which dusty German source you trust, is the first confirmed victory by a fighter jet. Now, note the target was a Mosquito, not another jet. The jet versus jet era was still a few years off in the skies over Korea. We'll get there in due course. Don't worry, it's a long video. While the Luftwaffe was experimenting with the Me-262, Britain was bringing its own jet to operational service, the Gloucester Meteor, a chunky, twin-engine fighter that entered RAF service in the summer of 1944. The Meteor's first proper job was not, as you might expect, hunting other fighters. It was hunting flying bombs. In June 1944, Nazi Germany had begun launching the V-1. A pulse jet-powered cruise missile, essentially, that putted across the Channel and slammed into London with a 1-ton warhead. The V-1s were fast, low, and small, and the only reliable way to stop them was to shoot them down over the countryside before they reached the city. The Meteor, with its jet engines, was finally fast enough to catch them. And that brings us to the 4th of August 1944, and one of the most quintessentially British incidents in the history of aerial combat. An RAF Meteor pilot, the records argue between Flying Officer Dixie Dean and Flight Lieutenant Joe Berry, depending on which logbook you believe, was closing in on a V-1 over Kent. It's where I'm from, it's my birthday, my county, everything. When his cannons jammed, he could have peeled off, gone home, written it up as bad luck. Instead, he flew alongside the buzzing missile, slid his wingtip carefully under the V-1's wingtip, and gave it a delicate little nudge. The V-1's gyroscopic guidance system, which absolutely hated being just touched, tumbled the bomb into a field where it exploded harmlessly into a cabbage patch instead of a London street. That is either genius, lunacy, or just distinctly British problem-solving, and if you've watched this channel for any length of time, you'll know that those are things we love. So, why, given all of this jet-powered cleverness, didn't the Me-262 and the Meteor change the outcome of the Second World War? Well, 3 reasons, and they're all really the same reason when you think about it. First, timing. The Me-262 didn't reach combat units in any meaningful numbers until the second half of 1944, by which point the Reich was already collapsing on 3 fronts, and Allied bomber streams were systematically pulverizing the German fuel industry. A faster fighter doesn't help much when there is nothing to put in it. Second, numbers. Around 1,400 Me-262s were built in total, but at any given moment, only about 300 were combat-ready, the rest grounded by damage, maintenance, or a lack of spare parts. The Luftwaffe was facing thousands of P-51 Mustangs, Spitfires, and Tempests, a numerical mismatch that no single wonder weapon was ever going to fix. Third, the engine themselves. The Me-262's twin Junkers Jumo 004 turbojets required a complete overhaul roughly every 25 flight hours, sometimes less if the pilot pushed the throttles a little too aggressively, which they always did, because they're fighter pilots. Somewhat expected. A modern F-16's engine runs thousands of hours between overhauls. The Me-262, in propulsion terms, was a Ferrari saddled with the service life of a Fiat. Allegedly, please don't sue me, Fiat. Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe fighter general who flew the Me-262 himself and lobbied desperately for it to be produced in greater numbers, famously described the experience of flying it as if angels were pushing. A line so good it survived every effort by historians to verify exactly when he said it. Whether or not he used those precise words, his point, if it was a point he made, stands. The men strapped into these aircraft knew the future when they felt it shoving them in the small of the back at 540 miles an hour. The future had arrived. It just hadn't arrived in time, in numbers, or with engines that could be relied upon to keep running long enough to win a war. The next chapter of fighter aviation would belong to the people who fixed those 3 problems, and they were, by 1945, already kicking the doors of a defeated Germany open and helping themselves to the blueprints. Inside the cockpit. Now, before we dive back into the chronological run today, which we felt was a sensible way to do today's video, we do need to talk about the people who actually fly these things, because the aircraft, it's only half the story. The other half is a human body strapped to the inside of it, trying desperately not to pass out. Imagine that you're sitting on a rocket-powered chair, on top of roughly 20,000 pounds of jet fuel, wearing a rubber mask, with the air pressure inside your cockpit equivalent to about 8,000 feet of altitude, even though the actual sky outside your canopy is near vacuum. Now imagine that's the safe part of your job, because the dangerous part is what happens when you pull the stick back hard and try to point the nose somewhere it didn't expect to go. That's when the G-forces hit you, and G-forces are where the romance of flying fighters runs headfirst into the limits of your weak human body. Pull a hard turn at 9 Gs, which a modern F-16 can sustain in level flight, and a 180-pound pilot effectively weighs 1,620 pounds. Picture a full-size fridge sitting on your chest while you try to do trigonometry in your head, because that is essentially the gig of fighter pilot. Your blood, obeying nothing more complicated than basic physics, wants to drain out of your brain and down into your legs. Your vision starts to tunnel. Color goes first, then the edges of your sight close in like a pair of curtains, and if you don't do something about it in the next couple of seconds, you're going to grey out, then black out, and the aircraft flies on without you until it hits the ground. And you die. Captain Carol Thunder Lee, a USAF F-16 pilot, has described that moment about as plainly as anyone. At 9 Gs, your vision tunnels, your body feels like it weighs 2 tons, but you fight through it. So, how exactly do you fight through it? Well, you wear what's called a G-suit, an inflatable garment wrapped around your legs and abdomen that squeezes hard the moment the aircraft loads up, physically forcing the blood back up towards your heart and your head. You also perform what pilots call the hook maneuver, a grunted, strained breathing pattern that keeps blood pressure up in your skull. So the romantic image of the steely-eyed ace gliding through a turn is, in reality, a sweaty man in a rubber corset making noises like a constipated weightlifter. They didn't really show that in Top Gun, did they? The jet may be glamorous, the breathing technique is not. If the aircraft itself decides to give up, engine out, structural failure, an enemy missile already in the act of removing the tail, something like that, the pilot's last option is, of course, the ejection seat. And the ejection seat is its own special category of violence. Modern seats are rocket-powered, with what engineers call zero-zero capability. This means that they can save your life from zero altitude at zero airspeed, sitting stationary on the runway with the canopy still over your head. The sequence takes well under a second. The canopy blows off or shatters, explosive bolts fire, a rocket motor under the seat slams you upwards at around 14 to 20 Gs of acceleration in the wrong direction, which is, to put it mildly, not exactly what the human spine evolved for. Survivors of ejections routinely have compressed vertebrae. They consider it a fair trade for surviving, unsurprisingly. Now, all of this is happening to one person inside a single cockpit. But the fighter, as a weapon system, is, as we said in the first chapter, much bigger than the aircraft. The pilot may fly the jet, but hundreds of people sustain the mission, and nowhere is that more visible than on the deck of an aircraft carrier. A carrier launch takes about 2 seconds. The catapult, a steam-powered or on the newest, fanciest carriers, electromagnetically powered, accelerates the aircraft from a standing start to around 150 knots, which is roughly 170 miles an hour, in the time it takes me to read this sentence. That's faster than most supercars hit 60, except the supercar doesn't have to be flying at the end of it. Landing is the same trick, in reverse. The aircraft slams onto the deck at about 140 knots, the tail hook snags one of 4 arresting wires stretched across the runway, and the wire stops the jet in roughly the same 2-second window. Pilots describe a carrier landing as a controlled crash, which it is, because the alternative, a soft, flared landing of the kind a civilian airliner does, would require a runway about 10 times longer than the ship. And then there's aerial refueling, which extends what a fighter can do in much less dramatic fashion. A KC-135 tanker trails a rigid boom from its tail, and the fighter pilot eases up behind it and below it until the boom operator can plug it into a receptacle just behind the canopy, and several thousand pounds of fuel flows across at altitude. Without that capacity, a single-engined fighter taking off from, say, Lakenheath in England simply cannot reach anywhere strategically useful, and so the modern fighter force is structurally tethered to its tanker fleet in a way that doesn't show up in those recruitment posters. And then there are the ground crews, the people you almost never see because the camera is always on the pilot. For every hour an early F-22 Raptor spent in the air, ground crews put in roughly 30 hours on the ramp, peering into access panels, replacing stealth coatings, swapping line-replaceable units, and arguing with a maintenance computer that always thinks that something is terribly wrong. The jet may be glamorous, the maintenance schedule is not. A modern frontline fighter is a modular, sensor-rich, software-defined weapon, and every one of those adjectives translates, on the flight line, into more wrenches, more diagnostics, and more late nights under a floodlight, possibly on a boat in the middle of the ocean. So when you watch a single F-35 howl past at an airshow, the correct mental image is a pilot, a plane, a tanker somewhere over the horizon, a dozen ground crew haven't slept properly in days, a software team in another time zone, and a steam catapult on a resting wire waiting for them to come home. That's the system. The aircraft is just the loud bit. How jets move. Alright, we've talked about what the human inside the cockpit goes through. So now let's talk about what's actually pushing them through the sky, because if you don't understand the engine and the airframe, none of the dogfights coming up in this script are going to make any sense. A jet engine, stripped to its essentials, is a very disciplined explosion happening continuously inside a metal tube. Air comes in the front through the intake. A compressor, a stack of spinning blades, you've seen them, squeezes that air down to a fraction of its original volume, which heats it up rather nicely. Fuel sprays into the compressed air in the combustion chamber and ignites, producing a hot, fast jet of exhaust gas that rushes out of the back. On its way, that exhaust spins a turbine, which is mounted on the same shaft as the compressor at the front, and that is what keeps the whole circus turning. Newton's third law does the rest, and that's for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, so, gas going backwards, jet moves forwards. That's a turbojet. A turbofan, which is what almost every modern fighter actually uses, adds a big old fan at the front that shoves a large amount of air around the outside of the core engine, making the whole thing more efficient at the speeds fighters actually fly at. It's the same principle, though. The same disciplined explosion, just with a bigger, quieter fan wrapped around it. If a pilot wants more thrust in a hurry, for a sprint or a climb or a fight, they can light something called the afterburner. Raw fuel is sprayed directly into hot exhaust behind the turbine, where it ignites and produces a long, glowing torture flame that can nearly double the engine's thrust. The cost of that is enormous fuel consumption. It absolutely goes through the roof, as well as making an infrared signature so bright that any heat-seeking missile within range will absolutely come and say hello. So, pilots use the afterburner in short, expensive bursts, the way you'd use the kettle if the electricity bill was like 200 quid a minute. And honestly, we just wouldn't have tea anymore, would we? How much thrust are we talking about here? Well, one F-16's single engine with afterburner lit produces roughly 28,000 pounds of force at full power, and even at the more typical military power setting around 70 to 20,000 pounds, that is enough continuous force to lift a fully loaded pickup truck clean off the ground and hold it there. Bolt that engine onto an airframe weighing about the same as the truck, and, well, you have an aircraft that can climb vertically while accelerating, which is not a thing any propeller-driven fighter could ever do. Surprise. But thrust alone doesn't make a fighter. The airframe has to be shaped to handle the speeds the engine can produce, and that's where wing design gets interesting. Around the speed of sound, roughly 760 miles per hour at sea level, air stops behaving like a fluid, and it starts behaving more like a wall. Shockwaves form along the wing. Drag spikes, and a straight-winged fighter of the 1940s would buffet, lose control, and in some cases simply tear itself apart. The fix, discovered independently by German and Soviet engineers in the late 1940s, was the swept wing. Angle the wings backward from the fuselage, and you delay the formation of those shockwaves, letting the aircraft slip closer to the speed of sound before things get nasty. The F-86 Sabre and the MiG-15, which we're about to meet over Korea when we get back to the chronology, I promise it's coming, were the first widely produced fighters built around that principle, and the difference between them and the straight-winged jets they fought alongside was night and day. By the 70s, designers had pushed the idea even further with the delta wing, a triangular shape that handles transonic and supersonic flight incredibly, and with something called relaxed stability. A traditional aircraft is designed to be stable, meaning if you take your hands off the stick, it will tend to fly straight and level. A relaxed stability fighter, like the F-16, is the opposite of that. The F-16, in raw aerodynamic terms, wants to tumble. It will not fly itself for more than a second or two before something departs from a sensible angle and the whole aircraft starts to wallow towards the ground. And that's actually a feature, because an unstable aircraft is also an incredibly maneuverable one. Small inputs produce big changes in attitude, which is exactly what you want in a knife fight at 20,000 feet. The only catch is that no human pilot can react fast enough to keep an aerodynamically unstable jet pointing in the right direction. So, well, you give the job to a computer, don't you? The F-16 was the first production fighter built around fly-by-wire controls, where the pilot stick no longer pulls the cables connected to the control surfaces. It sends an electrical signal to a flight computer, which makes upwards of 40 corrections per second to keep the aircraft doing what the pilot wanted it to do, rather than what physics would prefer. Pull the stick back and the computer interprets that as, I would like to pitch up by this many degrees, please and thank you, and it works out exactly how much to deflect each control surface in what sequence to get there without the aircraft tumbling out of the sky. Take the computer away, and the F-16, it's not going to work. The most modern fighters add one more trick on top: thrust vectoring. The exhaust nozzle at the back of an F-22 Raptor or a Russian Su-35 can swivel, redirecting the jet of hot gas up, down, or sideways, which means that the aircraft can change direction using brute engine force in addition to its aerodynamic surfaces. This lets a thrust vectoring fighter point its nose at a target, even at airspeeds where its wings have effectively given up. The aircraft can hang in the air on raw thrust alone for a few seconds, swing the nose around like a gun turret, and fire a missile at a target that by all conventional rules of aerodynamics should not be able to engage. Add it all together, a disciplined explosion in a tube, swept wings, fly-by-wire instability, and a nozzle that can point sideways, and you get the modern fighter aircraft. An aircraft that can fly faster than the fastest bullet of the Second World War, turn harder than any human pilot is really supposed to be able to tolerate, and respond to a pilot's input before the pilot has finished thinking about it. The engineers had handed the world's air forces something nobody really quite knew how to use yet. Working out how to use it took an actual war. And that war was waiting in Korea. MiG-Ali goes jet. When North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel on the 25th of June 1950, the United States and its allies had jets in their inventory, but most of them were what aviation historians politely call transitional, meaning they had jet engines bolted to airframes that still thought it was about 1945. The Lockheed F-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, was a straight-winged, decent-handling aircraft that could comfortably handle anything propeller-driven the North Koreans put in the air during the opening months of the war. That stayed true until November, when a new shape started appearing in the skies above the Yalu River. Swept-winged, fast, and climbing higher than the F-80 could comfortably follow. This was the MiG-15, a Soviet-built jet fighter that had been developed in part with the help of British Rolls-Royce Nana engines that the post-war Attlee government had, in one of the more bewildering decisions of the early Cold War, cheerfully sold to Stalin in 1946. The British had handed the Soviets the propulsion. The Soviets had bolted it on to one of the cleanest, most aerodynamically advanced fighters anyone had yet built. And now it was over Korea, shooting down American aircraft. On the 8th of November 1950, First Lieutenant Russell J. Brown, flying an F-80C of the 16th Fighter Interceptor Squadron, was escorting a strike near the Yalu when he tangled with a flight of MiG-15s and claimed one shot down. That engagement is widely credited as the first jet versus jet kill in history, though, as with most firsts in aviation, Soviet records have been arguing about it ever since, and there's a respectable case that a Soviet pilot got there a few days earlier. We'll let the historians fight it out. What's not disputed is that within weeks of the MiG-15's arrival, the United States had a serious problem on its hands because the straight-winged jets it had brought to Korea were now outclassed by a Soviet design they hadn't seen coming. The answer was the F-86 Sabre, North American, swept-wing, transonic, properly modern fighter, rushed into Korean theater service by December 1950. The Sabre and the MiG-15 were, on paper, remarkably evenly matched. The MiG could climb higher and had the heavier cannons. The Sabre had a better gun size, a much-loved G-suit for its pilots, and slightly nicer handling at the edges of the envelope. Where the two aircraft met, typically at 30 to 40,000 feet over a stretch of northwestern Korea, the American pilots nicknamed MiG-Ali, the fights came down to training, tactics, and the quality of the man behind the stick. And the men behind the sticks were, on both sides, really, really good. The American side produced names like Captain James Jabara, who became the first American jet ace in history when he claimed his 5th and 6th MiG kills on the 20th of May 1951, and Captain Joseph McConnell, who finished the war with 16 confirmed kills, making him the leading American ace of the conflict. The Soviet side, flying the MiGs in Chinese and North Korean markings under a thin pretense of plausible deniability that everybody saw through immediately, produced pilots like Colonel Yevgeny Pepelayev, credited by Soviet records with 19 Sabre kills and widely regarded as one of the deadliest MiG pilots of the war. Robbie Risner, an American Sabre pilot who later became a famous prisoner of war during Vietnam, described the experience of trying to nail a MiG-15 with everything you had. I was on his tail at 40,000 feet, skating on the edge of space, and I just couldn't get my guns lined up. The MiG kept sliding out of my sights. It was like trying to swat a fly in a windstorm. That sentence really captures, as well as any pilot has ever managed, what jet versus jet combat actually felt like once the romance of the dogfight wore off. The aircraft were going so fast, in air so thin, that the slightest miscalculation threw your gun sight off by hundreds of feet of lead, and your target only had to twitch his stick to disappear. So, how did the scoring shake out? Well, the United States came out of Korea claiming roughly 792 jet kills against approximately 78 Sabre losses to air-to-air combat, for a ratio of about 10-1. Soviet and Chinese archives opened after the Cold War suggested the real numbers were closer to 2-1 or 3-1 American advantage, with Soviet sources admitting to losing roughly 224 MiG losses across the war. Depending on whose filing cabinet you trust, MiG Ali's scorecard is off by a factor of 3. The historians still argue. What isn't in dispute is the larger point. Korea was the first war in which jets fought jets at scale, and the lessons came thick and fast. Swept wings were now mandatory, pilot training mattered more than ever, the G-suit was a genuine combat advantage, and the gun was still, for the moment, the weapon that decided things. Cannons on both sides were getting heavier, gun sights were getting cleverer, and the question hanging over the whole exchange was whether the gun would stay king once a new generation of weapons arrived. Because by the mid-1950s, the engineers had something else in mind. If you could build a missile that could chase down a fighter on its own, find its own target, and kill it without the pilot having to line up a gun sight at all, well, what was the gun even for? Supersonic speed and Sidewinder's first bite. So, the fighters of the 1950s were chasing two obsessions at once, and you could draw a straight line from the cockpit of an F-86 over Korea to both of them. The first obsession was speed. The second was the idea that a missile could do a pilot's job better than a pilot. Speed came first. By the early 1950s, every major air force was racing to build a fighter that could break the sound barrier, not in a dive, which several aircraft had already managed, but in level flight, on demand, as part of an ordinary mission. The American entry was the North American F-100 Super Sabre, descended from the same design lineage as the Korean War F-86. It first flew on the 25th of May, 1953, with test pilot George Welch at the controls, and on its maiden flight it went supersonic. That had never happened before with a production fighter. 2 years later, on the 20th of August 1955, an F-100C piloted by Colonel Horace Haynes set a new world absolute speed record at 822 miles per hour over a measured course at Edwards Air Force Base, the first official world speed record set at supersonic speed in level flight. Just to give you some perspective there, 822 miles an hour means you're traveling about 13.7 miles in a minute. At that pace, a flight from Los Angeles to San Francisco, a journey that takes a modern airliner most of an hour, would be done and dusted in roughly 26 minutes. The F-100 was, by the standards of 1955, incredible. Getting there required solving a mountain of small engineering problems. Wings had to be thinner, intakes had to be redesigned to manage supersonic airflow, and the airframe itself had to cope with aerodynamic heating. That's friction with the air at speeds which raised the skin temperature of the aircraft enough to weaken the aluminium, which is why later supersonic aircraft moved progressively toward titanium and steel construction. Chuck Yeager, who had punched through the sound barrier in the experimental Bell X-1 back in 1947, was characteristically blunt about what it took to fly these things well, quoting him, "There's no such thing as a natural-born pilot. Whatever I became was a result of a hard piloting job." The supersonic age, in other words, was not handed to anyone. It was earned in flight after flight by men working out which previously sensible piece of aerodynamic intuition was about to try and kill them next. The 1950s, to summarize, were aviation engineers discovering new ways to make pilots go really fast and then immediately discovering why that was so fucking scary. But raw speed had a problem. And the problem was that you could now overshoot a target so quickly that your guns, the same kind of cannons that had served fighter pilots since the First World War, only got a fraction of a second to bear. The answer the engineers reached for was the air-to-air guided missile. And the first one to actually work in combat was an American design called the AIM-9 Sidewinder, developed at the Naval Ordnance Test Station at China Lake in California by a team led by physicist William B. McLean. The Sidewinder was a heat seeker. A small infrared sensor in its nose looked for the hottest thing in its field of view, which in the 1950s sky meant the exhaust pipe of an enemy jet. Once the pilot heard a low growl in his headset, the audio tone the seeker made when it had locked on, he could pull the trigger and the missile would do the rest, chasing the target's tailpipe until it caught it or ran out of energy. Early Sidewinders were limited. They could only attack from behind in a tail chase, and they got confused by clouds, by the sun, and by any pilot smart enough to roll into a turn and break the lock. But when they worked really nicely. Its combat debut, when it came, was spectacular indeed. On the 24th of September 1958, during the Second Taiwan Strait crisis, a flight of Republic of China Air Force F-86 Sabres carrying AIM-9B Sidewinders engaged a formation of communist Chinese MiG-17s over the Strait of Taiwan, and in the space of a single afternoon scored 4 confirmed kills with 4 missiles fired, a 100% hit rate on debut. Those 4 Sidewinders in one afternoon downed more enemy jets than most Second World War aces had managed in a year of flying. General Curtis LeMay, then USAF Vice Chief of Staff, was so impressed by the Taiwanese pilot's performance that he later declared, "Taiwan has become a kingdom of fighter pilots." Coming from LeMay, who was not a man given to handing out compliments lightly, that was about the highest endorsement on offer. The day the dogfight got a homing instant, in short, was Wednesday, in September 1958, and the demonstration could not have been clearer. Missiles, the briefings began to say, were the future. Guns were the past. Why bother training pilots to maneuver a 6 o'clock gun position when a Sidewinder could do the same job from twice as far away with a fraction of the workload? Air forces across the West took that lesson and ran with it. The next generation of American fighters, including the legendary F-4 Phantom II, would be designed with no internal gun at all, just missiles, on the assumption that gun-range dogfighting was a problem the engineers had solved. That assumption, well, it was about to meet the skies over Vietnam, where the missile revolution would discover the hard way that it might not have been all it cracked up to be. Guns, missiles, sensors. So, how does a fighter jet actually fight? If you strip away everything and get down to air-to-air engagement, well, it's all about 3 categories of hardware bolted to the airframe: guns, missiles, and sensors that tell those weapons where to look. Get any one of them wrong, and the other 2 become a really expensive way of carrying jet fuel around, if you don't get shot down. Let's start with the gun, because it's the oldest and most stubborn member of the trio. Every fighter from the First World War onward had carried something that shoots solid projectiles out of the front of the aircraft, and despite roughly a century of attempts to make it obsolete, the gun is still bolted into the nose or the wing root of every frontline fighter flying today. The modern standard on American jets is the M61 Vulcan, a 6-barreled rotary cannon designed by General Electric in the 1950s and still in service across the F-15, F-16, F-18, and F-22 fleets. It fires 20mm shells at a rate of 6,000 rounds per minute, which works out to 100 rounds a second. The entire ammunition drum on an F-16 empties in about 5 seconds flat if the pilot holds the trigger down. Fighter pilots fire the Vulcan in bursts of half a second to a second at most, because by the time you've spent more than that, the target is either dead or they've moved out of the cone of fire entirely. Missiles are where the last 70 years of fighter design have really done most of their evolving, and they split broadly into 2 families based on how they find their target. The first family are the heat seekers, descendants of the AIM-9 Sidewinder that we already met over the Taiwan Strait in 1958. And they look for the infrared signature of an enemy aircraft, the hot exhaust pipe, the friction-heated leading edges, anything that glows in the part of the spectrum that the human eye can't see. The pilot calls Fox 2 over the radio when one of these comes off the rail, and the missile flies itself the rest of the way, no further input required from the cockpit. The second family is the radar-guided missiles, and they do need a bit more explaining because the way they work has actually changed twice in the last 40 years. The older approach is called semi-active radar homing, used by weapons like the AIM-7 Sparrow. The launching fighter has to keep its own radar locked on the target for the entire flight of the missile, painting the enemy aircraft with radar energy that the missile homes in on as it reflects back. That works, but it has a catch. The pilot can't maneuver freely, can't break off, can't engage anyone else until the missile either hits or misses. He's tied to the target by a beam of radar like a fisherman who can't put down his rod. The newer approach, used by the AIM-120 AMRAAM that entered service in the 1990s, is called active radar homing. The missile carries its own little radar in the nose, and once it gets close enough to the target, it switches that radar on and it finds the enemy by itself. The pilot then calls Fox 3 on launch, and then a few seconds later, when the missile's own radar takes over, the cockpit hears the word pitbull, meaning the missile is now hunting independently, so the launching aircraft is free to turn away, and the enemy pilot has approximately the time it takes to read this sentence to do something really rather clever or die. If the weapons are the teeth, though, the sensors are the eyes, and modern fighters carry an insane number of them. The big one is still the radar in the nose, but on 4th generation plus aircraft like the F-22 and F-35 and the latest F-15s and F-16s, that radar is what's called an AESA, an active electronically scanned array. Instead of spinning one dish, an AESA uses thousands of tiny transmit-receive modules that can steer the radar beam electronically in nanoseconds with no moving parts at all. The thing can track dozens of targets simultaneously, jump between air search and ground mapping in the same sweep, and is much harder to jam than older radars because it can hop between frequencies on the fly. Bolted alongside the radar on many modern fighters is an IRST, or infrared search and track sensor, which spots aircraft by their heat signature without emitting anything at all, useful for hunting stealth targets that have been designed specifically to be invisible to radar. The cockpit also carries a radar warning receiver that pings when somebody else's radar is painting the aircraft, a data link that ties every friendly fighter in the formation into a shared picture of the sky, and on the newest jets, a helmet-mounted display that paints targeting symbols directly onto the pilot's visor, letting him look at an enemy aircraft off to one side and cue a missile to it just by turning his head. Now, of course, there's also the other side, and that's why every fighter also carries countermeasures designed to confuse the very weapons that we just described. Flares, burning magnesium decoy, that look like exhaust plumes to a heat seeker, pop out of dispensers in the tail when a pilot suspects an IR missile is on the way. Chaff, which is essentially clouds of metallized paper strips, blooms behind the aircraft to confuse radar-guided missiles, giving the seeker 100 fake targets to choose from. Bigger jamming pods can broadcast electronic noise that blinds enemy radars entirely, and dedicated electronic warfare aircraft like the EA-18G Growler exist specifically to do that job for everyone else in the strike package. Put it all together, and what you actually have in a modern engagement looks less like the dogfights people imagine and more like two pilots staring at screens trying to murder each other politely from 40 miles away. Sensor chess plus high-speed physics plus the occasional moment of brutal close range if both sides survive the missile exchange and end up in visual range. Radar Intercept Officer Rob Doremus, sitting in the back of an F-4B Phantom during the first MiG kills of Vietnam, left behind one of the cleanest descriptions of how that teamwork actually sounded inside the cockpit when the fight got close. Pull up, fly the dot, push over, go down. 2 people, 1 airframe, 1 shared problem, and a missile launch met, ideally, by countermeasure on the other end, with both pilots talking faster than their hands can move. Vietnam breaks the theory. Which all brings us to the moment all of that wonderful, elegant theory walked right into a buzzsaw, because the United States went into Vietnam convinced the gun was a museum piece and came out understanding why the museums kept getting raided. The headline aircraft of the American war over Vietnam was the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II, a brutish, twin-engine, 2-seat fighter that had no internal cannon at all when it first entered service. None. The Pentagon, drunk on Sidewider's debut and the promise of beyond visual range Sparrow missiles, had decided that gunfights at close quarters were a problem the engineers had solved, and that the future of air combat would be fought entirely at missile range by aircraft that didn't need to maneuver into a 6 o'clock kill position anymore. The doctrine hardened, and that doctrine got built into the airframe. There were 2 things that the missile-only doctrine hadn't quite reckoned with, though, and both of them were waiting over in Vietnam. The first was the rules of engagement imposed on American pilots by their own commanders, which often required a visual identification of an enemy aircraft before firing, collapsing the beyond visual range engagement into a knife fight at a range where the missiles actually had a minimum arming distance below which they couldn't fuse. The second was the enemy itself. North Vietnamese MiG-17s and MiG-21s were smaller than the Phantom, they were lighter, they were more nimble in a turn, and crucially, they were being vectored onto American formations by ground-controlled intercept directors who could see the whole battle on a radar screen and pick the moment to send their fighters climbing up out of the haze. On the 17th of June 1965, two US Navy F-4s from the VF-21 off the USS Midway, flying combat air patrol north of the demilitarized zone, used AIM-7 Sparrow missiles to down a pair of MiG-17s, the first confirmed American air-to-air kills of the Vietnam War. The doctrine looked, briefly, vindicated. Then the numbers came in over the following months and years, and the picture got significantly less rosy. By the middle of the war, American kill ratios against the North Vietnamese had collapsed to roughly 2-1, and against MiG-21 specifically, in some periods, close to even. Compare that with the roughly 10-1 ratio the same Air Force had claimed in Korea barely a decade earlier, and you have the awkward situation of an air arm that had got measurably worse despite flying significantly better aircraft. The Sparrow missile, designed to be a beyond visual range game ender, was achieving a hit probability of around 10% in actual combat against the 70% it had managed on the test ranges of New Mexico. This was a terrible statistic, and it was happening on every other launch. And at this point, dogfighting needed to be reinvented, and the man who showed the US Air Force how to do it was a mustachioed, cigar-chewing colonel called Robin Olds, commanding the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing out of Ubon Air Base in Thailand. Olds had been a P-38 and P-51 ace over Europe in the Second World War, and he was the rare senior officer in 1966 who believed in the old verities of energy management, maneuver, and trickery. On the 2nd of January 1967, Olds led a mission called Operation Bolo, and it remains one of the cleanest deception operations in the history of air combat. The North Vietnamese MiG-21 force had been having a successful time bouncing American F-105 Thunder Chief bomber formations as they ran in on their targets. The F-105 was fast and tough, but it was not built for dogfighting, and the MiGs knew exactly when and where to find it. Olds reasoned that if his Phantoms could pretend to be F-105s, the MiGs would climb out of their airfields, expecting easy prey, and find themselves face-to-face with fighters carrying full missile loads and looking for a fight. The deception was meticulous. Phantoms flew F-105's exact route, at the F-105's exact altitude, on the F-105's exact refueling timings, using the F-105's exact call signs. They even carried jamming pods configured to produce the F-105's electronic signature. The North Vietnamese ground controllers watching their radar scopes saw what they expected to see, a strike package, and scrambled MiG-21s accordingly. When the MiGs broke through the cloud layer expecting bombers, what they found were Phantoms with sidewinders armed and waiting. In roughly 12 minutes of combat, Olds and his pilots downed 7 MiG-21s for 0 losses, somewhere around half of North Vietnam's operational MiG-21 force erased in a single engagement. Olds had been blunt for years about why the missile-only doctrine was getting his men killed, and after Bolo, he was blunter still. Pilots needed to be taught to dogfight again because the alternative was burying them. The doctrinal pivot took a few more years, but it did come. The F-4E variant of the Phantom, introduced in 1968, finally got what its predecessors should have had from day one: an internal M61 Vulcan cannon bolted into the nose where it belonged. The US Navy, meanwhile, commissioned a fleet-wide study under Captain Frank Alt into why its missile shots were missing, why its pilots were losing engagements they should have won, and what could be done about it. The resulting Alt report, published in 1968, ran to nearly 500 pages and became the founding document of an institution that we'll come to in a moment. And lest anyone think the North Vietnamese were just lucky bystanders to all of this American self-examination, consider Nguyen Van Choc, the leading Vietnam People's Air Force ace of the war, credited with 9 confirmed American aircraft kills, flying the MiG-21. Soc's tactical philosophy, drilled into him by Soviet and Vietnamese instructors and refined in combat, was pretty straightforward. Climb high under ground control, dive at American formations from above with all the energy that height gave him, fire 1 atoll missile or 1 cannon burst at the most vulnerable target, then dive away before the escorts could turn. Hit and run. No turning fight, no second pass, no romance. The Americans, with their bigger aircraft and longer-range missiles, were not allowed to fight the war that they'd trained for. They were forced to fight Soc's war instead, and they bled accordingly. The missile-only doctrine wasn't just wrong on paper. It was, by the late 1960s, getting Americans shot down at a rate the Pentagon could no longer pretend was acceptable, and the institutional response to that uncomfortable maths was about to land at a sun-baked naval air station outside San Diego. Top Gun gets real. That naval air station was Miramar, and on the 3rd of March 1969, the United States Navy stood up a small, scruffy, almost embarrassingly under-resourced school that they called the Navy Fighter Weapons School, immediately nicknamed Top Gun by the handful of pilots assigned to it. There was no glossy facility, no dedicated aircraft fleet, and very, very little money. The founding instructors had to scrounge airframes from other squadrons and beg flight hours from a navy that was at that point more interested in buying new jets than in teaching the old ones how to be used. The founding commander, Dan Yank Peterson, a 33-year-old lieutenant commander who had flown F-4s in combat and come home convinced the Navy was training its pilots for the wrong war. Peterson and his small instructor cadre built a syllabus around three things that had been almost entirely absent from pre-war phantom training. Adversary tactics, taught by instructors flying smaller, more agile aircraft in the role of MiG-17s and MiG-21s, energy management theory, which boiled down to teaching pilots how to trade altitude for speed and back again without ever losing both, and brutally honest debriefings, in which every flight was dissected on a whiteboard afterward in front of one's peers with no rank pulled and no excuses accepted. If you had flown badly, the room would tell you about that and they would be right. The improvement was incredible. Pre-Top Gun, US Navy fighter crews in Vietnam had been managing a kill ratio of roughly 2-to-1 against North Vietnamese MiGs. Post-Top Gun, in the air combat of 1972 and the linebacker operations, that ratio rose to something approaching 12-to-1, a 6-fold improvement attributed almost entirely to training, since the aircraft involved were the same Phantoms with the same missiles flown by the same kind of young men. The Air Force, watching all of this, would eventually stand up its own version of the idea in 1975 called Red Flag, run out of Nellis Air Force Base in the Nevada desert and built around the same principle that you could not learn modern air combat without flying against a dedicated professional adversary force trying their absolute best to kill you. And, well, then came the film. In 1986, Paramount Pictures released Top Gun, starring Tom Cruise as Lieutenant Pete Maverick Mitchell, and convinced an entire generation of teenagers that the appropriate career path was naval aviation, that aviators wore Ray-Bans in the cockpit, and that the correct response to losing a wingman was a beach volleyball match.
Let's go!
The film gave the world the deathless line from Tom Iceman Kazansky,
"You can be my wingman anytime."
followed by Maverick's immediate
Bullshit. "You can be mine."
classic. US Navy recruitment officers reported their phones ringing solidly for months afterward, with one base near a cinema multiplex claiming a 500% spike in walk-in inquiries from young men who had just stumbled out of the auditorium with their pupils dilated. The real Top Gun, in fairness, was less volleyball montage and more brutally honest PowerPoint presentations before PowerPoint even existed. A small group of pilots in a small set of rooms with a whiteboard, an ashtray, and the willingness to tell a colleague he'd nearly killed himself that morning because of a mistake that he hadn't yet noticed. The film made the brand. The school did the work. And both, in their very different ways, sent recruitment numbers through the roof, while the actual content of the syllabus stayed largely classified and considerably less photo-worthy. Teen series takeover. By the time the Vietnam-era lessons had been written into doctrine and burned into the muscle memory of a generation of instructors, the aircraft themselves were already being replaced, and the replacements would define what most people picture today when they hear the words fighter jet. The 70s and 80s brought what aviation circles call the fourth generation, and in American service specifically, a quartet of designs nicknamed the Teen series after their numerical designations: the F-14 Tomcat, the F-15 Eagle, the F-16 Fighting Falcon, and the FA-18 Hornet. The Soviet Union answered with the MiG-29 Fulcrum and the larger, longer-ranged Su-27 Flanker, both of which were every bit the equal of their Western counterparts in raw performance, if not always in supporting electronics. The Grumman F-14 Tomcat, which entered US Navy service in 1974, was the swing-wing carrier fleet defender, with wings that could sweep forward for slow carrier approaches and back for supersonic dash. Its job was to sit a couple of hundred miles out from the carrier battle group and shoot down Soviet bombers before they could launch their anti-ship missiles, and to that end it carried the AIM-54 Phoenix, a long-range, radar-guided weapon capable of engaging targets nearly 100 miles away, decades before any other Western fighter could pull that trick off. The Phoenix's actual combat record was pretty modest, but its aura was enormous, and the F-14 still carries a cinematic gravity that no other Cold War fighter really can match. The McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle, which we've already met as the holder of that astonishing 100+0 air combat record, entered US AF service in 1976 as a dedicated air superiority machine built around a single guiding instruction issued by Air Staff after Vietnam. That was not a pound for air to ground. It had two enormous Pratt & Whitney F-100 engines, between them producing a thrust-to-weight ratio of around 1.07 when lightly loaded, meaning the aircraft generated more thrust than it weighed and could, in the right configuration, accelerate while climbing vertically. The General Dynamics F-16 Fighting Falcon, which entered service in 1978, was something stranger. A lightweight, single-engine, fly-by-wire fighter designed around a doctrine the United States Air Force has spent most of the previous decade trying to ignore. Behind it was a small, abrasive group of officers and analysts inside the Pentagon known informally as the Fighter Mafia, led by Colonel John Boyd, a former fighter pilot turned theorist whose mathematical work on energy maneuverability theory had quietly rewritten the way air forces thought about what made one fighter better than another. Boyd's argument, distilled, was that agility, the ability to change speed and direction faster than your opponent, mattered more than raw size, weight, or weapons load, and that a small, cheap, ferociously responsive fighter would beat a big, expensive, sluggish one in any sustained engagement. Pierre Sprey, another member of the group, pushed the argument even further than the historical evidence really supports, and remains a contested figure even among Boyd's admirers. But the core idea was sound, and it produced an aircraft that could pull 9G sustained, fly with a side stick controller instead of a center stick, and let the pilot see out of a bubble canopy with a field of view that no previous fighter had matched. The McDonnell Douglas F/A-18 Hornet, entering Navy and Marine Corps service in 1983, was the multi-role, carrier-capable answer to the question of what happens when you can't afford a fleet of dedicated air superiority Tomcats, a dedicated attack A-7s, and dedicated reconnaissance aircraft, all separately. The Hornet was supposed to do all of those jobs on a single airframe, and to a remarkable degree, it actually managed it. The catch, then of course there was a catch, was the price tag and the implications it carried for fleet size. Roughly 5,200 F-4 Phantoms were built between 1958 and 1981, enough to equip the air forces of a dozen Western nations with hundreds of aircraft each. Compare that to the F-22 Raptor, which we'll come to in just a couple of chapters. Just 187 production aircraft built before Congress closed the line in 2011. From regiment-size buys to handful-size buys in 2 generations, the fighters had got better, faster, smarter, deadlier, and there were dramatically fewer of them, each one carrying a price tag that would have brought an entire squadron of Phantoms a couple of decades earlier. That trade-off, fewer, more capable, vastly more expensive aircraft, would define the next chapter of the story when stealth arrived and rewrote everything all over again. Foxbat lands in Japan. So throughout the late 1960s and into the early 70s, Western intelligence had been rather concerned over a Soviet aircraft they'd only ever glimpsed in grainy reconnaissance photos and the occasional Moscow airshow flypast. The aircraft was the Mickey Yengurovich MiG-25, NATO reporting name Foxbat, and the dossier on it was pretty scary for the people in the Pentagon. The thing flew at Mach 3-ish, which is to say more than 3 times the speed of sound, climbed to altitudes that put it out of range of most Western interceptors, and looked from the outside like a swept-winged, twin-tailed monster of an airframe with intakes the size of dustbins. In 1971, an Israeli pilot in a Phantom over the Sinai had locked onto a Foxbat on a reconnaissance run, watched his target accelerate past Mach 3, and then watched his radar lose the lock entirely as the Soviet aircraft simply ran away from him in level flight. That report, when it landed on desks in Washington, was the moment a lot of American program managers got rather concerned. If the Soviets had built a Mach 3 super interceptor in serial production, the entire Western tactical aircraft fleet was about to look a little bit embarrassed, and the F-15 Eagle program, then still in development, was suddenly being designed for a target that might already be flying. Then, on September 6, 1976, Lieutenant Viktor Belenko of the Soviet Air Defense Forces solved the West's intelligence problem in the simplest way possible. He stole one and gave it to them. The 29-year-old Belenko had been flying patrols out of Chugyevka Air Base in the Soviet Far East, and for reasons that ran from political disgust to personal misery in a system he'd stopped believing in, he peeled off from a routine training flight, dropped to wave-top altitude to slip under Japanese radar coverage, and landed his fully fueled MiG-25P at Hakodate Civilian Airport on the Japanese island of Hokkaido, overrunning the runway by several hundred feet because the strip was far too short for the aircraft that he was now trying to stop. He climbed out, fired his service pistol into the air to keep curious onlookers back, and asked the bewildered Japanese authorities for political asylum in the United States. The Western intelligence community had not stolen the Foxbat. The Foxbat had taxied itself into their hands with a defecting pilot in the cockpit, asking for help. What followed at Hyakuri Air Base, where the Japanese trucked the disassembled aircraft to for joint analysis with American technicians, was the equivalent of Christmas morning, and the presents inside the wrapping paper were not exactly what the West had been bracing for. The MiG-25 was indeed extremely fast, but the speed had been bought at a price that made every Western analyst rethink some pretty core assumptions. The aircraft's two enormous Tumansky R-15 engines were essentially brute-force turbojets descended from a cruise missile power plant capable of pushing the airframe past Mach 2.8 with relative ease and theoretically to Mach 3.2. A Foxbat, indeed, had been clocked doing exactly that over Egypt in 1973. But the trick came with a problem that the Soviets had apparently chosen to live with. Push the engines past Mach 2.8, and they ran so hot the turbine blades began to deform. Indeed, the airframe that hit Mach 3.2 in Egypt landed with engines so wrecked that they had to be replaced entirely. The Foxbat could hit Mach 3 once, and then it needed a new set of engines for its trouble. The avionics were a bigger shock, though. The MiG-25's electronics, when the American technicians pulled the access panels and started photographing the interior, were largely built around vacuum tubes, the same glowing glass and wire components your grandfather had in his radio. The F-15 that had been designed in part to counter this aircraft was running on solid-state transistor electronics roughly a decade more advanced. So why had the Soviets stuck with vacuum tubes in 1976? Well, because vacuum tubes, for all their bulk, were extraordinarily resistant to the electromagnetic pulse of a nuclear detonation, and the Foxbat had been built with the assumption that its operating environment would involve nuclear weapons going off nearby. Mad? Yeah, possibly. Consistent? Yeah. Also that. The rest of the teardown filled in the picture. The MiG-25 was not a multi-role air superiority fighter at all. It was a high-speed, high-altitude interceptor with limited maneuverability, a short combat radius of about 300 kilometers, and the turning agility of a freight train. The Soviet superfighter the West had been dreading was a single-purpose missile truck designed to climb fast, shoot once, and head home, with hopefully its engines not being destroyed. Belenko himself, in extensive debriefings later turned into the 1980 book MiG Pilot, co-written with John Barron, described his impressions of the gap between Soviet propaganda and Soviet reality with a frankness that helped his American hosts more than any photograph of the avionics ever could. Japan returned the aircraft to the Soviet Union in November 1976, disassembled, in crates, and minus several items the Soviets had asked for. The strategic lesson, however, ran in two directions at once. The West learned that its great Soviet bogeyman had been considerably less terrifying than feared, and the Soviets, properly stung, went back to their drawing boards and accelerated work on the aircraft that would actually scare NATO in the 1980s, the MiG-29 Fulcrum and the Su-27 Flanker, both genuinely fourth-generation designs that could trade punches with the Teen series on something close to even terms. Belenko, for his part, was granted American citizenship by an act of Congress, lived quietly in the US for the rest of his life, and died in September 2023 at the age of 76, having spent nearly half a century as a consultant to the people whose intelligence problem he'd personally solved on a Japanese runway. Fighter jets go strategic. So, if the Belenko episode taught the world that fighters were intelligence prizes, the next major lesson delivered 5 years later in the skies over Iraq was that a small flight of fighters could rewrite politics of an entire region in basically an afternoon. The aircraft is no longer just a dogfighter, in other words. It's a scalpel, a hammer, or a diplomatic grenade, depending on what the government wants it to do that morning. On the 7th of June 1981, 8 Israeli Air Force F-16A Fighting Falcons, escorted by 6 F-15A Eagles flying high cover, took off from Etzion Air Base in the southern Sinai on a mission that the Israeli planners had codenamed Operation Opera. Each F-16 carried two unguided 2,000-pound Mark 84 bombs, roughly 945 pounds of high explosive in each weapon, enough to collapse a multi-story reinforced building with a single hit. The target was the Osirak nuclear reactor at the Al-Tuwaitha Nuclear Research Center near Baghdad, a French-supplied facility that the Israeli government under Prime Minister Menachem Begin had concluded was weeks away from being fueled with enriched uranium and beginning a path to weapons-grade material. The route was pretty damn insane on paper. The strike package flew more than 1,100 kilometers each way across the airspace of Saudi Arabia and Jordan at altitudes low enough to slip beneath the radar coverage of 3 different hostile air forces, with no aerial refueling and a fuel margin so tight that several pilots later admitted they were not sure they'd make it home. Approaching Osirak, the F-16s pulled up into a steep dive, released their bombs from low altitude in a precisely sequenced run, and reduced the reactor dome to rubble in under 2 minutes over target. All 14 Israeli aircraft returned to base. Iraqi air defenses, which had been alert hours earlier for unrelated exercises and then stood down, did not fire a single effective shot. 8 aircraft, 1 reactor, 2 minutes on target. The Iraqi nuclear weapons program, years of work, hundreds of millions of dollars in French and Italian supplied equipment, an entire diplomatic edifice built around plausible deniability, was erased roughly in the time it takes to boil an egg. The diplomatic response was immediate and overwhelmingly hostile. The United Nations Security Council in Resolution 487 strongly condemned the Israeli strike. The US temporarily suspended deliveries of additional F-16s to Israel. And Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, and not someone usually shy about endorsing the use of force against unfriendly governments, delivered a verdict from London that was about as cold as Downing Street ever gets in public. Quoting, "Armed attack in such circumstances cannot be justified. It represents a grave breach of international law." That a conservative British Prime Minister in the middle of the Cold War was condemning an Israeli strike on a nuclear program run by a regime nobody in Whitehall particularly trusted tells you how seriously the diplomatic blowback was being taken. What the strike actually did, of course, was demonstrate something the world's defense ministries have been quietly suspecting for a decade. A handful of modern fighters in capable hands could achieve in one mission what would have required a strategic bomber fleet or an army group before. Earlier that same year, on the 19th of August 1981, 2 American F-14 Tomcats from VF-41 off of the USS Nimitz had shot down 2 Libyan Su-22 fitters over the Gulf of Sidra after the Libyans fired first in an engagement that lasted under a minute. A smaller flashpoint, certainly lower stakes and a different message. The United States flexing its muscle in international waters that Colonel Gaddafi had unilaterally claimed as Libyan, and using a brief air-to-air kill as a strong diplomatic message. Fighters had become message senders. The lesson of 1981, taken together, was that the fighter had become a political instrument as much as a military one, useful for breaking nuclear programs, nudging dictators, and changing a regional balance of power overnight. The next year, in the skies over Lebanon, the Israelis would teach the world a different and even more uncomfortable lesson, this one about what happens when one side has built not just better aircraft, but an entire networked system around them. The Bekaa Valley Turkey Shoot. So, in June 1982, Israel launched Operation Peace for Galilee, a ground invasion of southern Lebanon aimed at pushing PLO forces back from the Israeli border, and within days the operation collided with the Syrian Arab army's presence in the Bekaa Valley, a strip of high ground between 2 mountain ranges where Syrians had spent the previous several years installing one of the densest surface-to-air missile networks in the world. Roughly 19 SAM batteries, mostly Soviet-supplied SA-6 Gainfuls, along with older SA-2s and SA-3s, sat in the valley waiting for any Israeli aircraft foolish enough to fly into their engagement envelopes. On paper, the Bekaa was supposed to be a no-go zone for the Israeli Air Force. On June 9, 1982, the Israeli Air Force decided to call that bluff. What happened over the next several hours, in an operation the Israelis named Mole Cricket 19, was the first major demonstration in history of what defense theorists now call system of systems warfare, the moment when fighter aircraft stopped being individual weapons and started being these nodes in a coordinated network. The Israeli plan roughly went like this. First, small unmanned drones, Mastiffs and Scouts, both unarmed, both built in Israel for exactly this purpose, were flown into the Bekaa to provoke the Syrian SAM operators into switching on their fire control radars. The drones, with their tiny radar cross-sections, looked enough like incoming aircraft to be worth shooting at, and the Syrian crews obligingly lit up their radars to acquire them. Meanwhile, Boeing E-2C Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft loitered offshore over the Mediterranean, hoovering up every electronic emission from the Syrian air defense network and feeding the locations and frequencies of every active radar in real time to a coordinating cell on the ground. Within minutes, the Israelis had a live, continuously updated map of every SAM battery in the valley. The next wave were the killers, Israeli F-4E Phantoms carrying American-supplied AGM-78 Standard Arm anti-radiation missiles that homed in on radar emissions fired into the car from the SAM's engagement range, with each missile riding the very radar beam the SAM crew had just switched on. Long-range artillery shells, cued by the same electronic warfare information, rained onto the SAM batteries from across the Lebanese border. Within roughly 2 hours, 17 of the 19 Syrian SAM batteries had been destroyed or knocked out of action, and the Bekaa Valley, minutes earlier a hornet's nest of radar-guided missiles, was an open sky. That open sky was the trap. The Syrian Air Force, on hearing that its SAM screen had collapsed, did exactly what any Air Force would do in the same situation. It scrambled MiG-21s and MiG-23s from its bases inside Syria to engage the Israeli strike aircraft and protect what was left of the air defense network. Climbing into the now clear airspace over the Bekaa, Syrian pilots flew directly into the killing zone of Israeli F-15 Eagles and F-16 Fighting Falcons, orbiting at higher altitude, vectored onto their targets by the same Hawkeyes that had run the SAM suppression a few minutes earlier. The Israeli pilots had radar warning, data-linked situational awareness, an altitude advantage, and AIM-7 Sparrow and AIM-9L Sidewinder missiles in the rails. The Syrians had a Soviet-style ground control intercept doctrine whose ground controllers were currently dying in the rubble of their command bunkers and had no idea what was waiting above them. Over roughly a week of intermittent air combat from the 9th of June onwards, Israel claimed 88 Syrian aircraft destroyed in air-to-air engagements for 0 air-to-air losses of its own. 33 of the kills attributed to the F-15 Eagle, 44 to the F-16 Fighting Falcon, and 11 to other Israeli types, including Kafirs and Phantoms. Syrian sources have disputed those figures for 40 years and continue to do so, with Damascus historically claiming a more even exchange, though even the lowest credible Syrian estimates concede catastrophic losses against minimal Israeli ones. The exact number in the end matters less than the order of magnitude. 88 jets in a week is roughly 7 full fighter squadrons, equivalent to wiping out RAF Fighter Command's order of battle on a typical day during the Battle of Britain in 1940. Together, the 33 and 44 kills claimed by the F-15 and F-16 alone add up to more aerial victories than the top 10 Allied aces of the Second World War combined. The number that's a bigger problem, though, is the comparison with 1973. In the Yom Kippur War, 9 years earlier, the Israeli Air Force, fighting the same Syrian opponents over much the same airspace with broadly similar pilot quality on both sides, had lost roughly 85 aircraft, many of them to exactly the kind of SAM systems the Bekaa operation had just dismantled. From 85 losses in 1973 to effectively 0 air-to-air losses in 1982 against the same enemy. The hardware had changed. Sure, the Eagles and Falcons were a generation ahead of the Phantoms and Skyhawks of 1973, but what had changed far more dramatically was the things connecting the hardware. The drones, the Hawkeyes, the anti-radiation missiles, the data links, the integrated electronic warfare, the entire ecosystem, which was turning individual aircraft into a single hunting organism with 1,000 sensors and one mind. Iftach Spector, the Israeli F-15 pilot, squadron leader, and later author of the memoir Loud and Clear, has been blunt for years about what actually made the difference in the Bekaa, and his point is not the one Hollywood would have chosen. The aircraft were excellent, sure. The missiles were excellent, also. But Spector had consistently argued that the deciding factor was the obsessive, repeated, year-round training the Israeli pilots had been put through and the situational awareness that came from being plugged into a network that told every pilot in the formation in real time where every other friendly aircraft was and where every threat had just appeared. The jet, in his view, was no longer the whole weapon. The network was the weapon. Whatever the precise body count, the lesson of Bekaa was identical for every air force on the planet. Buying better fighters was not enough. You had to buy the AWACS, the drones, the electronic warfare aircraft, the data links, the training pipeline, the ground controllers, and the integrated command and control architecture that tied the lot together, or you were going to lose your air force in a single afternoon to someone who had figured that shit out. The Soviets, watching their export customers get systematically dismantled with Soviet-supplied equipment, drew exactly the conclusions that you would expect and accelerated their own networked warfare programs. The Americans who had supplied the F-15s and F-16s and the E-2C Hawkeyes took the data home, fed it into their doctrine, and started building toward the air war that they would actually fight 9 years later over Iraq. Desert Storm owns the sky. So on the 2nd of August 1990, Iraqi forces under Saddam Hussein invaded and annexed Kuwait. And over the following 5 months, a coalition of 35 nations assembled in Saudi Arabia under American command, while Saddam, addressing his people on Baghdad radio, promised that any attempt to dislodge him would meet the mother of all battles. The actual mother of all battles, when it arrived, turned out to be a one-sided affair conducted from 30,000 feet, since the Iraqi Air Force, on paper the 6th largest in the world with roughly 750 combat aircraft including MiG-29s, Mirage F-1, and the same MiG-25 Foxbats we spent a chapter dismantling, discovered within hours that paper meant remarkably little. At 2:38 a.m. local time on the 17th of January 1991, the air campaign of Operation Desert Storm opened with American AH-64 Apache helicopters destroying 2 Iraqi early warning radar sites near the Saudi border, and within minutes, Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk stealth aircraft were over Baghdad, dropping laser-guided bombs onto communication nodes, presidential bunkers, and the Air Defense Operations Center in the center of the city. Behind the F-117s came waves of F-15 Strike Eagles, F-111 Aardvarks, A-6 Intruders, F-A-18 Hornets, Tornado GR-1s of the RAF and the Royal Saudi Air Force, and B-52s lumbering in at altitude with conventional bomb loads. Coordinating the whole circus from orbit over Saudi Arabia were Boeing E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft, the same airborne early warning concept the Israelis had used in the Bakar, scaled up by an order of magnitude. By dawn on the first morning, Iraq's integrated air defense system had effectively ceased to exist as a coordinated network, and the Iraqi Air Force was being torn apart every time it tried to scramble. The F-15C Eagles of the USAF's 33rd Tactical Fighter Wing, vectored by AWACS controllers who could see the entire Iraqi air picture in real time, swept Iraqi MiGs and Mirages out of the sky at distances where the Iraqi pilots often did not realize they were even being engaged until their radar warning receivers started screaming. Captain Steve Tate of the 1st Tactical Fighter Wing scored the first coalition air-to-air kill of the war about an hour into the campaign, downing a Mirage F-1 with an AIM-7 Sparrow from roughly 12 miles out. Over the 43-day air campaign, coalition aircraft would record 39 confirmed air-to-air kills against the Iraqi Air Force for 2 air-to-air losses, and one of those losses, the FA-18C Hornet of Lieutenant Commander Michael Scott Spiker, shot down on the first night of the war by what is now widely believed to have been an Iraqi MiG-25 firing a long-range R-40 missile, served as a reminder that the Foxbat, even with its vacuum tubes and its overheating engines, still had a sting if a coalition aircraft strayed into the wrong piece of sky. 39 kills in 43 days. That's almost 1 per day, the highest sustained Western air-to-air kill rate since the Vietnam War, achieved against an air force flying broadly comparable Soviet hardware to what Western fighters were designed to defeat. The F-15 Eagle, in particular, extended the perfect scorecard we mentioned in the first chapter and walked out of Desert Storm with its 0-loss record, not just intact, but bulked up by a healthy run of Iraqi aircraft taken out of the sky. What the Iraqi Air Force did next was the closing punchline. Beginning in the last week of January 1991 and continuing through the rest of the air campaign, somewhere between 115 and 140 Iraqi combat aircraft, MiG-29s, MiG-23s, Mirage F-1s, Su-24s, even a handful of civilian airliners pressed into the exodus, took off from their bases in western Iraq and flew east across the border to land at airfields in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran recently emerged from an 8-year war with Iraq that had killed somewhere north of 500,000 of its own people, was perhaps the single country in the region least likely to be considered a sympathetic safe haven by anyone in Baghdad. The Iraqi pilots flew there anyway because the alternative was being destroyed on their own tarmac by coalition strike aircraft hitting hardened shelters with bunker-busting bombs. Iran, taking the view that an unexpected gift was still a gift, impounded the aircraft and never returned them. Tehran eventually pressing several of the more modern types, including MiG-29s and the Su-24s, into service with the Islamic Republic of Iran Air Force, where some of them are reportedly still flying today. Roughly 130 warplanes, about 1/3 of Saddam's combat air force, defected en masse to a country he had spent the 1980s trying to invade. And look, if your Air Force escapes to a rival country for safety, you've lost the air war, haven't you? General Norman Schwarzkopf, commanding officer of the coalition from his headquarters in Riyadh, summed up the situation in a January 30th press briefing with a kind of dry military understatement, quote, "Allies have air supremacy and are reducing the Scud threat." Schwarzkopf knew what those words actually meant, and so did every Air Force chief watching from a capital outside the coalition. Desert Storm was the moment Western air power, refined through Vietnam, retooled through the Teen series, networked through Bakar-style integration, and led by pilots trained at Top Gun and Red Flag, walked onto a modern battlefield and demonstrated what total air superiority actually looked like in a conventional war. The sky belonged to them. And in a hardened bunker outside Baghdad, the lesson Iraqi planners took away, the lesson indeed that every Air Force without a peer-level Western coalition behind it took away from the spring of 1991, was that you could not win a conventional war from beneath an enemy that owned the sky. The next question, occupying defense ministries from Beijing to Moscow to Tehran from that point onwards, was whether anything could be done to take the sky back. The answer the Americans were about to demonstrate was that they'd already been working on the next move for the better part of a decade, and it was painted matte black. How stealth hides. So how do you hide a fighter jet from radar? Well, the short answer the Lockheed Skunk Works gave the Pentagon in the late 1970s was that you don't. Not really. You just make the radar really doubt itself and hopefully look somewhere else. Stealth, in other words, is not a cloak of invisibility. It's a campaign of misdirection waged against electromagnetics. And it's worth understanding the 4 or 5 tricks involved before we get to the night that somebody figured out how to beat it. Now, the headline concept is something called radar cross-section, usually abbreviated as RCS, and it's the number that defines this entire thing. RCS is, roughly speaking, the size of the radar reflection an aircraft throws back at whoever is looking for it. And the key word there is roughly, because the radar reflection of a given object can be wildly different from its actual physical size. A flat metal panel angled directly at a radar dish will throw back a return the size of a barn. The same panel angled 30 degrees off the radar dish will throw back almost nothing. Shape matters more than mass, and that single insight is what made stealth possible in the first place. So let's consider the numbers. The conventional 4th-generation fighter, an F-15 and Su-27, take your pick, has a frontal radar cross-section in the rough neighborhood of 10 square meters, which is to say a radar dish looking at one sees something roughly the size of a parked SUV reflecting back at it. A modern stealth fighter, depending on which figure you trust and how much of it is still classified, has an RCS of around 0.001 square meters, or thereabouts, which is to say that the radar sees something roughly the size of a sparrow. That's a reduction by a factor of 10,000. The aircraft, of course, hasn't shrunk. It is still a 40,000-pound jet with a pilot inside, but to the radar that's hunting it, it's effectively become a little sparrow. So how exactly do you drop a fighter's RCS by 4 orders of magnitude? Well, that would be with 4 tricks, all stacked on the same airframe, and none of them would do the job on their own. The first is shaping, which is where Lockheed started in the 1970s with the Have Blue demonstrator that would become the F-117 Nighthawk, the angular oddity that opened the stealth era and looked, in the dry words of one Skunk Works engineer, like a paper airplane folded by an engineer with strong opinions, because that is basically what it was. The F-117 was covered in flat-angled facets, no curves, anywhere on the airframe, because the computer-aided design software available in the 70s could only model radar reflections of flat surfaces, and Lockheed's engineers were doing the underlying mathematics by hand and on slide rules with no capacity to model the radar return of a smoothly curved shape. So, they built the aircraft out of flat panels, each one angled to deflect incoming radar energy in any direction other than back toward the transmitter, and, well, then they just prayed that the maths would work out. Ben Rich, who ran the Skunk Works through the F-17 program and is rightly called the father of stealth, recalled the moment in his memoir Skunk Works when his team first measured the radar return of a Have Blue model on a test pole and realized the number was an order of magnitude smaller than anything anyone else had ever built, small enough that the engineers initially thought that their instruments were broken. They weren't broken. They'd just made a shape that really, really worked. The second trick was radar absorber material, usually abbreviated as RAM or RAM, which is the matte black coating that you see on every stealth aircraft from the F-117 onwards. RAM is essentially a paint or a panel laced with iron-based compounds that absorb incoming radar energy and convert a portion of it into low-grade heat, rather than reflecting it back to the transmitter. It's not a magic skin. A stealth fighter painted in radar absorber material is still mostly relying on its shaping to do the heavy lifting, but the coating soaks up enough of the residual return at the edges and seams in order to drop the final RCS another meaningful notch. The downside is that RAM is fragile, finicky, expensive, and degrades in rain, humidity, and ordinary flight line handling. Maintainers spend an enormous amount of time touching it up, which is part of why a stealth fighter costs what it costs to keep in the air. The third trick is hiding the bits of the aircraft that radar finds easiest to see, and the worst offender by far is the engine. An engine intake is a deep cylindrical cavity that funnels straight back to a spinning compressor face, and a spinning compressor face is, electromagnetically speaking, a f***ing disco ball. It returns radar from every angle imaginable. So, stealth designers route the intake ducts in serpentine S-curves that block any direct line of sight from outside the aircraft to the compressor blades, and they sometimes line those ducts with additional RAM panels just for good measure. Weapons, similarly, are kept inside internal bays rather than hung on external pylons, because a missile bolted to the underside of a wing, not exactly stealthy. A stealth fighter that opens its bay doors to fire a missile briefly becomes much less stealthy in that instant, which is why the open and close sequence is choreographed down to the fraction of a second. The fourth trick is the smoothness of fifth-generation aircraft like the F-22 Raptor and the F-35 Lightning II, which look nothing like the F-117's faceted oddity because computing finally caught up with what they wanted to do. By the 1990s, design software could model the radar return of smoothly curved surfaces, and the resulting shapes, blended fuselages, sculpted intakes, sawtooth panel edges, produce even better RCS performance than the F-117's facets, or flying like actual fighters, rather than the F-117's flying brick aerodynamics. And you'll be forgiven for thinking that that adds up to invulnerability, but, well, every stealth designer in the world will tell you that no, it doesn't. Stealth works best against the high-frequency radars used for weapons targeting, the X-band and Ku-band systems mounted on fighters and on most surface-to-air missile fire control units. Against low-frequency radars in the VHF and UHF bands, which were already considered obsolete by NATO in the 1980s, stealth shaping is much less effective because the wavelengths of those older radars are too long for the careful geometry to deflect cleanly. A low-frequency radar won't give a missile crew a precise targeting solution on its own, but it can tell them that something is up there that's worth investigating, and it can do so from really far away. Add clever tactics, a patient operator, and the right timing, and that something up there can, of course, become a target. And that brings us to the night that somebody actually did this. Vega 31 falls. So the night was the 27th of March, 1999. The war was NATO's Operation Allied Force, a 78-day bombing campaign against Yugoslav forces conducted in response to the ethnic cleansing of Kosovo Albanians by the regime of Slobodan Milosevic. The aircraft was a Lockheed F-117A Nighthawk of the United States Air Force, call sign Vega 31, piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Dale Vigil Zelko, an experienced F-117 driver flying out of Aviano Air Base in northern Italy. And the man waiting for him on the ground was a 43-year-old Yugoslav air defense colonel called Zoltan Dani, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 250th Air Defense Missile Brigade and operating a Soviet SA-3 Goa surface-to-air missile system that had been designed back in 1961. And that is worth dwelling on for a moment. The SA-3 was older than the pilot that it was about to shoot down. It used vacuum tube electronics, mechanically steered radar antennas, and a guidance approach that NATO planners had pretty much written off as obsolete by the early 1980s. It was old, but it wasn't stupid, and Zoltan Dani was about to demonstrate why those two phrases, not the same thing. Dani had spent the weeks leading up to that night doing his homework. He had observed the NATO air campaign carefully enough to notice the F-117s, despite the secrecy that surrounded their operations, and that they were flying broadly repetitive routes, the same ingress corridors, the same approximate timing windows, the same predictable bomber stream behavior that air planners had been baking into mission profiles for decades. He had stationed civilian spotters near the perimeter of Aviano Air Base to phone in F-117 takeoffs in real time, giving him roughly an hour of warning before the aircraft reached its engagement zone. He had drilled his crews relentlessly on a single tactical rule: keep the fire control radar switched off as much as possible, and when you do switch it on for no more than about 20 seconds at a time, then move the battery to a new firing position before NATO's anti-radiation missiles could lock onto your emissions. Danny's battery had relocated more than 100 times during the campaign, never staying in one place long enough for NATO's electronic warfare aircraft to fix him. That night, with his spotters reporting F-117s airborne out of Aviano and his crews waiting in the cabins outside the village of Budanovici, about 30 miles west of Belgrade, Danny made one more tactical bet. He had reconfigured his SA-3's targeting radar to operate at a lower frequency than the system's designers had originally intended, on the suspicion that a longer wavelength stood a better chance of getting a usable return off a stealth aircraft. The Yugoslav technicians have been doing this kind of improvisation for weeks across the air defense networks, fiddling with their gear in a way that the Soviet manuals didn't exactly approve of, on the idea that something the manuals didn't approve of was exactly what was required here. At around 8:15 p.m. local time, with Vega 31 inbound on a strike run against a target in the Belgrade area, Danny's crew picked up an intermittent radar return at a range of roughly 13 kilometers. They turned on the fire control radar for approximately 17 seconds, and in that short window, with the F-117 caught at a moment when its bomb bay doors were open and its radar cross-section was briefly larger than usual, the crew fired 2 SA-3 missiles in quick succession. The first missile missed, the second one detonated close enough to Vega 3 to tear the aircraft apart midair, sending Zelko's Nighthawk into an uncontrollable spin, from which the only escape was the ejection handle. Zelko later described the few seconds after the missile hit as the most disorientating moments of his career: a violent tumble, a flash of fire, and the sudden realization that the aircraft he'd trusted to keep him invisible had just become a fireball, and he was inside it. He punched out at low altitude, his parachute opened, and he landed in a freshly plowed field somewhere near the village of Ruma with his survival radio, his pistol, and the rather uncomfortable understanding that he was now a downed pilot in hostile territory with a nationwide manhunt about to begin. To quote him, "I was dragging my chute in a field in Serbia, thinking, I can't believe I'm the guy who got shot down in a stealth." For the next 6 hours, Zelko hid in a furrow in the field while Yugoslav army patrols and civilian volunteers swept the area with torches and tracker dogs. He could hear vehicles passing on a road a few hundred meters away. He could see the lights of search parties moving across the fields. He stayed flat on his stomach, in the mud, communicated with his rescue coordinators in short whispered transmissions, and waited. A US Air Force Combat Search and Rescue Task Force MH-53 Pavlo helicopters out of Tuzla, A-10 Warthogs flying top cover, and a small army of pararescue jumpers pushed into Serbian airspace under the cover of darkness, located him before dawn, and lifted him out of the field somewhere around 2 a.m. local time on the 28th of March. He was back at Aviano by breakfast, shaken but uninjured, and the news that an F-117 had been shot down was already on every television in the world. The wreckage, that was a different story. Most of the larger structural pieces of Vega 31, the canopy, the ejection seat, a substantial chunk of the left wing sections of the avionics bays, were recovered by Yugoslav forces over the following days and trucked to Belgrade, where they were paraded as propaganda before being sent on to the Belgrade Aviation Museum near Nikola Tesla Airport, where they remain on display to this day. Serbian children appeared in the streets in the days following the shoot-down wearing t-shirts printed with the deathless slogan, "Sorry, we didn't know it was invisible," which is the sort of dark humor that only emerges from a population that has spent the last decade on the wrong end of various wars and learned to take its victories wherever they can find them. Russian and Chinese intelligence services, naturally, expressed considerable interest in the surviving pieces of stealth coating and panel geometry. Some of those pieces, by most credible accounts, ended up in Moscow and Beijing within weeks. Doctrinally, the shoot-down was an absolute earthquake. The F-117 had flown more than 1,300 combat sorties across 2 wars, the 1991 Gulf War and the 1999 Kosovo campaign, and had been hit precisely once. A loss rate well under 0.1% across the entire operational history of the type is, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary success for a combat aircraft, and stealth as a concept came out of the Allied force campaign overwhelmingly vindicated. But almost never shot down is not the same as never shot down, and the difference, on the night of March the 27th, 1999, was one Yugoslav colonel with an old Soviet missile system and a willingness to think outside of the box and ignore the manual. A little over a month later, on the 2nd of May 1999, Yugoslav forces would shoot down a US AF F-16CJ as well, with that pilot also rescued, demonstrating that the SA-3 threat was not a one-off and that conventional fighters in the same airspace were even more vulnerable than the stealth aircraft had been. The Yugoslav air defense network, beaten down but never fully suppressed across the whole campaign, killed 2 NATO aircraft in 78 days of bombing, a small fraction of the sorties flown, but definitely enough to make the point. The coda to the story that arrived years later in a way that nobody involved in the original could have really predicted. Dale Zelko and Zoltan Dani, the American pilot and the Serbian colonel who'd shot him down, met in person several times during the 2010s with their families for a Serbian documentary called The Second Meeting. They became, by every account, friends. Dani, a baker by trade after retiring from the Air Force, baked bread for Zelko's family. Zelko, a man with a quiet sense of humor about what had happened to him, visited Dani's village. Neither man bore the other any apparent grudge. The men at both ends of these incredibly violent systems, it turns out, are people, and people sometimes manage things that their governments just never quite get around to. The most advanced aircraft in the world had been shot down by a SAM older than the pilot. The lesson, when Air Force planners across NATO sat down to absorb what had happened, was not that stealth had failed. It was that predictability had. 5th-generation flying computers. So, if the 1999 shootdown taught the West that stealth alone was not a guarantee of survival, the response from American program officers was not to abandon stealth, it was to bolt stealth onto absolutely everything else they could think of and make the resulting aircraft so absurdly interconnected that even a clever opponent with a clever SAM would struggle to find the moment to take the shot. The result was the 5th generation of fighter aircraft, and at this point, the pilot is not just flying a jet. They are managing a really expensive supersonic computer with missiles attached. The Lockheed Martin F-22A Raptor entered operational service with the USAF in December 2005 after a development program that had begun in the early 1980s and absorbed something close to $30 billion before the first squadron stood up. The F-22 was conceived as a pure air superiority replacement for the F-15 Eagle, designed to fight the next generation of Soviet fighters that the Cold War was expecting to produce. And then, with the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, the aircraft found itself looking for a mission against an enemy that no longer existed. It got built anyway, in much smaller numbers than originally planned, and what it brought to the table was a combination nobody else had matched since. Stealth shaping comparable to the F-117, but on an airframe that could actually fight, that had thrust-vectoring engines that allowed it to point its nose at angles where conventional fighters would have stalled. It had super cruise capability, meaning it could fly above Mach 1.5 without lighting the afterburner, and the first true sensor fusion cockpit in the world. Now, sensor fusion is the bit that matters most for what's coming next. A 4th-generation fighter pilot in an F-16 or an F-15 has multiple displays in front of them, each one showing the output of a different sensor. Radar on one screen, radar warning receiver on another, data link on a third, and the pilot is expected to synthesize all of that information in their head, while also flying the aeroplane and managing the engagement. A 5th-generation fighter pilot looks at a single screen, on which a single integrated computer has already done the synthesis, fusing radar, infrared search and track, electronic surveillance, data link, and onboard missile systems into one continuous picture of the battle space. Threats appear as symbols, friendlies appear as other symbols, the aircraft knows, the pilot knows, and the cognitive workload on the pilot drops by an order of magnitude in exactly the situations where cognitive workload used to kill people. Production of the F-22 was capped by Congress at 187 operational aircraft in 2011, partly because each one cost something close to $350 million all in, and partly because the geopolitical case for a dedicated air superiority fighter against a peer Soviet adversary has become considerably less obvious, there being no Soviet Union at all. The aircraft has never been exported, never been allowed to fly in formation with foreign air forces in the way the F-15 and F-16 routinely do, and remains the most jealously guarded combat platform in the American inventory. Its younger and considerably more numerous sibling is the Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II, which entered full operational capability with the US Marine Corps in 2015 and has since become the standard 5th-generation fighter of essentially the entire West. The F-35 was designed from the start as a multinational, multi-role platform. 3 variants on a common airframe, with the F-35A flying from conventional runways, the F-35B doing the short takeoff and vertical landing trick for marine assault ships, and the Royal Navy's Queen Elizabeth-class carriers, and the F-35C doing catapult-launched carrier operations for the US Navy. Operators now include the US, the UK, Israel, Japan, Australia, Italy, South Korea, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Poland, Finland, and a growing list of others. The aircraft is, by some margin, the most expensive weapons program in the history of military procurement. A single F-35A in 2024 costs roughly $80 to $100 million, depending on the variant and the configuration, about the price of 2 Boeing 737s, or roughly what a regional airline pays for its entire small jet fleet. The total life cycle cost of the program, when projected out over its expected service life of half a century or more, sits at around $1.7 trillion across all operators, a number roughly equivalent to the entire annual GDP of Spain. For all that money, what the F-35 actually does in combat looks really different from the dogfighting heritage that we've been looking at through the script. The F-35 doesn't always fight. Sometimes it just sees and then tells everyone else what to shoot at. Its sensor suite, the AN/APG-81 AESA radar, the distributed aperture system of 6 infrared cameras giving the pilot a full 360-degree view through the airframe via the helmet-mounted display, the electronic warfare system that detects and classifies emitters at long range. It turns the aircraft into a network node that can hoover up the entire electromagnetic picture of the battle space and broadcast it to every friendly platform in range. In recent exercises, F-35s have been used to guide missile shots fired by older F-15s and F-16s flying safely behind them, with the older aircraft never needing to switch on their own radars at all. The fifth-generation fighter is essentially the quarterback, the eyes, the brain, and the missile trucks behind it, they're the muscle. Combat use has been quieter than the brochures suggested, mostly because the great power confrontation the aircraft was built for has just not arrived. But it has arrived in scattered engagements. On the 22nd of May 2018, Major General Amikam Norkin, then commander of the Israeli Air Force and veteran F-15 pilot of multiple previous campaigns, announced from a conference in Herzliya that Israel is the first country to have used the F-35 fighter plane in combat, confirming what air watchers had been suspecting from movements out of Nevatim Air Base for months. Israeli F-35Is, locally modified with Israeli avionics and electronic warfare systems, had reportedly been operating over Lebanon and Syria, conducting strike missions against Iranian-linked targets without ever being engaged by the Syrian air defense network that they were flying through. The Chinese and Russian fifth-generation entries fill out the global picture, though both with significant caveats. The Chengdu J-20 Mighty Dragon entered People's Liberation Army Air Force Service in 2017 and is now operational in considerable numbers, with most Western analysts treating it as a long-range stealth interceptor optimized for hunting tankers, AWACS, and other high-value support aircraft rather than as a pure dogfighter in the F-22 mold. The Sukhoi Su-57 Felon, Russia's fifth-generation offering, has been produced in much smaller numbers and has had a troubled development history. Reports of its use over Ukraine since 2022 have generally placed it well behind the front lines, lobbing standoff weapons rather than entering contested airspace. What unites all 4 fifth-generation types across 3 rival blocks is the assumption that the aircraft is now a node rather than a soloist. The idea of the single ace flying alone is over. The era of the integrated network, the F-35 as the quarterback, the AWACS as the coach, the tanker as the fuel pump, the satellite as the referee. Well, that's the era the world's air forces have actually arrived at, whether they can afford it or not. Contested skies today. And that brings us to the air war of the present moment and the rather awkward observation that for all the money spent and all the stealth bolted onto everything, the world's fighter forces in 2020 are operating in an environment where genuine air superiority, the Desert Storm fantasy of one side owning the sky from horizon to horizon, has become considerably harder to achieve than in the 90s. Take the events of the 24th of November, 2015, when a Turkish Air Force F-16C scrambled to intercept what its controllers described as airspace violations near the Turkish-Syrian border, and they shot down a Russian Su-24M Fencer ground attack aircraft with an AIM-9X Sidewinder, the first time a NATO member had downed a Russian military aircraft since the Korean War. The Russian pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Oleg Peshkov, was killed by ground fire after ejecting. His weapons systems officer, Captain Konstantin Muraktin, survived and was rescued. Vladimir Putin, addressing the Russian public from Sochi within hours of the incident, called the shootdown a stab in the back delivered by accomplices of terrorists, and the diplomatic relationship between Moscow and Ankara collapsed for the better part of a year afterwards. 18 months later, on the 18th of June, 2017, Lieutenant Commander Michael Mob Tremel of the U.S. Navy Striker Fight Squadron VFA-87, flying an F/A-18E Super Hornet off the carrier USS George H.W. Bush, shot down a Syrian Air Force Su-22 fitter near the town of Tabqa after the Syrian aircraft attacked U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces ground troops below. Schemmel fired an AIM-9X at the Su-22 first, which the Syrian pilot defeated with flares. Then he followed with an AIM-120 AMRAAM that struck the fighter and brought it down. The Syrian pilot ejected and was reportedly captured. The engagement was the first US air-to-air kill since 1999, an 18-year gap during which the most powerful air force in the world had not fired an air-to-air missile at another aircraft in anger. It was 2 decades between American dogfights. The world got quieter for the F-15. But it's now getting loud again. The most consequential air war of the present moment, of course, is the one being fought over Ukraine since the Russian invasion of February 2022. And the headline lesson from that is the one nobody in Western air power community really wanted to learn. Neither Russia nor Ukraine has achieved meaningful air superiority over any sustained portion of the front lines. Russia, with a vastly larger and more modern fighter force on paper, has been unable to operate freely over Ukrainian-held territory because of the density of Ukrainian surface-to-air missile coverage, a combination of Soviet-era S-300s, Western-supplied Patriots, NASAMS, IRIS-T, and a small zoo of shorter-range systems that, between them, have made the airspace above the front line lethal for any aircraft below medium altitude. And that's not even mentioning the drones. Ukraine, in turn, has been unable to challenge Russian air operations more deeply because its own fighter fleet is too small and too geographically constrained to absorb the losses that contesting Russian airspace would require. The result, according to the International Institute for Strategic Studies and to open-source loss trackers like Oryx, has been an air war fought largely with standoff weapons and loitering munitions in which Russian fighters typically operate from inside Russian airspace and lob glide bombs and cruise missiles from beyond the engagement range of Ukrainian air defenses, while Ukrainian fighters operate similarly briefly and from low altitude, dashing in to fire Western-supplied missiles and dashing out before SAM coverage can lock them up. In July 2023, after months of debate inside NATO, the United States and a coalition of European allies, including Denmark, the Netherlands, and Norway, approved the transfer of F-16 Fighting Falcons to Ukraine, with the first aircraft arriving in the country in the summer of 2024 after extensive pilot training in Romania and elsewhere. The political significance was substantial, Western-designed fighters entering an active European war for the first time since 1945, though the operational significance has so far been modest, with the Ukrainian F-16 fleet operating under exactly the same SAM constraints as the MiG-29s and the Su-27s they partially replace. The lesson from Ukraine, in short, is not that fighters are obsolete, it's that fighters without air defense suppression are in serious trouble, and that the Bakar Valley playbook of 1982, in which a competent operator with the right network tools could dismantle a Soviet-pattern integrated air defense system in an afternoon, gets a great deal harder to execute when the opposing side has spent the last 40 years studying exactly that playbook and is no longer making the mistakes Syria made. Further east in the South China Sea and across the Taiwan Strait, fighter aircraft now spend much of their operational time conducting intercepts that look more like maritime diplomacy than air combat. The People's Liberation Army Air Force flies regular incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, sometimes more than 100 aircraft in a single day during exercise periods, and the Republic of China's Air Force scrambles F-16Vs in response. American P-8 Poseidons and Australian P-8s patrol contested waters. Chinese J-16 and J-20s shadow American B-52s on routine flights through international airspace. Nothing fires, nobody dies, but once again, these days, it seems that fighter jets are doing diplomacy. What every air force on the planet's now wrestling with behind closed doors is the same fundamental problem that the Israelis solved in 1982 and the Americans demonstrated in 1991. The fighter on its own is not enough. It never was. The fighter, plus the AWACS, plus the tanker, plus the seed package, plus the satellite, plus the integrated command and control architecture, plus the trained I need a breath, plus the trained pilots, plus the maintenance pipeline. That, taken together, is what wins air wars. And every component of that system in 2024 has become more expensive, more contested, and more vulnerable to a peer adversary willing to fight about electronically, kinetically, and across every domain at once. The sky is no longer something one side simply owns. The sky has gone back to being something both sides have to fight for every day. Drone wingmen tomorrow. Alright, so where does fighter aviation actually go from here? If the lesson of the last 30 years has been that no single aircraft wins an air war on its own, the lesson of the next 30 looks to be a bit stranger. That the aircraft sitting next to you in the formation may not have a person in it at all and may, depending on how the day goes, not be coming home. The headline program in the West is the United States Air Force's Next Generation Air Dominance Effort, usually shortened to NGAD, which is intended to replace the F-22 Raptor as the dedicated air superiority platform from sometime in the 2030s onwards. In September 2020, Dr. Will Roper, then the USAF's Assistant Secretary for Acquisition, told a virtual conference of the Air Force Association that a full-scale NGAD demonstrator had already flown. Quoting him, "We've already built and flown a full-scale flight demonstrator in the real world, and we broke records in doing it." A statement that landed in the aerospace press with the force of a small earthquake, given that no journalists had previously had so much as a grainy hangar photograph of the aircraft in question. The aircraft flew, the Air Force confirmed, and almost everything else about it remains classified at a level several rungs above the curiosity of our scriptwriter. Come on, let us in on the secrets. We want it on the Slack channel. What the USAF has been considerably more open about is the aircraft expected to fly alongside NGAD when the program reaches the squadrons, and those aircraft are where the future gets, well, properly weird. The umbrella term is the Collaborative Combat Aircraft, or CCA, and the concept boils down to a flock of semi-autonomous stealth drones, each one designed to operate under the loose supervision of a piloted fighter, extending the formation's sensors, carrying additional weapons, and when the situation calls for it, flying into the part of the airspace that nobody wants to send a human being into. Frank Handel, who served as Secretary of the Air Force from 2021 to 2025, has been the loudest public voice on what this network is actually meant to do. Speaking at multiple Air and Space Forces Association events through 2023 and 2024, Kendall has consistently described a target ratio of roughly 2 CCAs for every piloted fighter, and a target cost per drone in the region of $25 to $30 million, about a quarter of the price of an F-35A. 2 drone wingmen, in other words, cost less than a single piloted fighter, and the formation that emerges from those numbers looks nothing like the 4-ship of 4th-generation fighters that has been the standard NATO building block since the 1970s. So, how's that meant to work in practice? Well, imagine a single-piloted NGAD fighter operating somewhere over the Western Pacific with 2 CCAs flying ahead of it as forward sensor nodes, 2 more flying alongside it as missile carriers, and the human pilot in the center of the formation, acting less as a stick-and-rudder dogfighter and more as a mission commander, watching the integrated picture on his cockpit displays and assigning targets to the autonomous wingmen on the wing. The drones do the dangerous flying, the drones absorb the first shots if shots are taken. The drones, if any of the scenarios USAF planners openly discuss, are not expected to come home, and that's not a tragedy in the program's logic. It's kind of the point. $25 to $30 billion for one. The technology demonstrators are already flying. The Kratos XQ-58 Valkyrie is a stealthy, jet-powered loyal wingman drone with a range of around 3,000 kilometers and a price tag in low-rate production of somewhere around $4 to $6 million per unit. So basically a steal. And it's been flight testing with the USAF since 2019. The Boeing MQ-28 Ghostbat, developed in Australia in partnership with the Royal Australian Air Force, has been flying in formation with crewed FA-18 Hornets since 2023, demonstrating exactly the kind of human-machine teaming that the doctrine has been promising for years. In April 2024, an experimental version of the F-16 called the X-62A Vista, with an artificial intelligence agent flying the aircraft, conducted a within-visual range dogfight against a human-piloted F-16 over Edwards Air Force Base, with the then USAF Secretary Frank Kendall sitting in the front seat of the AI-controlled jet while the algorithm flew the aircraft for him. It's got to be pretty terrifying. That's the first time in the history of fighter aviation that a sitting government minister has gone into a dogfight as the passenger of a machine. Outside the United States, things are looking a bit similar. Europe is splitting its 6th-generation efforts across 2 competing programs, the Future Combat Air System, FCAS, being developed jointly by France, Germany, and Spain, on a Dassault-led airframe, and the Global Combat Air Program, or GCAP, formerly known as Tempest, being developed jointly by the UK, Italy, and Japan, around a BAE Systems Leonardo Mitsubishi consortium. Both programs envisage a piloted core fighter operating with autonomous, loyal wingman drones, both targeting a service entry somewhere in the 2035 to 2040 window, and both, at the moment, guzzling money in the early development phases at a rate that would make a sovereign wealth fund nervous. NGAD itself, in the latest Pentagon estimates, is projected to cost somewhere around $300 million per piloted airframe, roughly 3 times the price of an F-35A, and the most expensive fighter unit cost ever proposed, partly because the aircraft is expected to lead a flock of cheaper drones rather than fight alone. The strategic logic is straightforward once you accept the underlying mathematics. Ultra-expensive piloted fighters in the low hundreds of airframes worldwide, supplemented by cheaper expendable drones in the low thousands. The expensive part of the formation carries the human and the sensor fusion. The cheap part of the formation carries the risk. For the first time in the history of fighter aviation, the part of the formation most willing to die is also the part that costs the least to build, which is, when you think about it, really rather elegant and also really bleak. The next wingman, in short, may not be a cocky young pilot in aviator sunglasses, chewing gum on the ramp at Nellis. It may be an algorithm, running on hardened processors inside a disposable stealth airframe, taking instructions from a human commander 40 miles behind it, and asking no questions about the survival odds. Cool? Yes. Unsettling? Also expensive? Oh boy. Fighter jets become pop culture. Okay, before we land today's video, we need to talk about the other place fighter jets live, which is not on a flight line in Nevada or a carrier deck off Okinawa, but inside the imagination of roughly everyone who has ever paid for a cinema ticket. The film that did most of the heavy lifting, obviously, was Top Gun, released by Paramount Pictures in May 1986, directed by Tony Scott and starring Tom Cruise as Lieutenant Pete Maverick Mitchell. The film grossed somewhere north of $350 million on a budget of around $15 million, and it gave, Tom Cruise used to be able to get it for a steal, and it gave the world the deathless exchange between Maverick and Tom Iceman Kazansky.
You can be my wingman anytime.
Followed by Maverick's immediate,
You can be mine.
The US Navy. Second time in today's episode. We couldn't resist, could we, writer?
You gotta let him go, sir.
The US Navy, which had cooperated with the production and even stationed recruiters in the lobbies of certain cinemas, reported recruitment inquiries spiking sharply in the months after the release, with naval aviation applicants in particular jumping by figures variously quoted around 400 and 500%, depending on which base you asked. Whatever the precise number, the phones rang for months. The sequel arrived in 2022, Top Gun Maverick, with Cruise reprising the role at the age of 59, and the production company persuading the US Navy to let real F/A-18 Super Hornets do almost all of the aerial photography in the film. The fictional Dark Star hypersonic aircraft in the opening sequence, designed in cooperation with Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works, was rendered convincingly enough that aviation forums spent weeks debating whether it was based on a real classified program. Maverick grossed close to $1.5 billion worldwide and reminded a new generation of cinemagoers that the appropriate response to losing a wingman is, evidently, still some kind of beach sports montage. Fighter aircraft. What's the song they played during that? That's a banger. Fighter aircraft turn up everywhere else in popular culture once you start looking for them. The dogfight sequences in Star Wars from the Trench Run in 1977 onwards were storyboarded by George Lucas using gun camera footage of actual Second World War and Korean War aerial combat as reference material, which is why the X-Wings and TIE fighters chase each other in ways that look suspiciously like P-51s and Me-109s. The Transformers franchise made the Deception Starscream into an F-22 Raptor. The Marvel Cinematic Universe sent Iron Man into a memorable chase with two F-22s in the original Iron Man in 2008. The Ace Combat video game series, running since 1995, has sold over 15 million copies on the premise of letting players fly real-world fighters in fictional wars. The Japanese Macross anime franchise, which gave the West Robotech, built an entire science fiction universe around fighter aircraft that transformed into giant robots, which is, if you think about it, just sensor fusion taken to its logical conclusion. The aircraft themselves perform live for crowds every summer through the airshow demonstration teams, the US Navy Blue Angels in their blue and gold F/A-18 Super Hornets, the USAF Thunderbirds in their red, white, and blue F-16s, the Royal Air Force Red Arrows in their Hawk trainers, the Italian Frecce Tricolori, and the French Patrol de France. Stadium flyovers before American football games had become so routine that the Pentagon was forced to confirm in 2015 that it had been paid by professional sports leagues to conduct what fans had assumed were patriotic gestures from the goodness of the military's heart. And then there are the internet memes. The missing F-35 that wandered off from a Marine pilot's stricken aircraft over South Carolina in September 2023 and prompted the US Marine Corps to put out an actual public appeal asking civilians to help find a stealth fighter. Then there's the Jet Noise Sound of Freedom t-shirt sold at every base exchange in America, the ongoing internet joke about whether anyone actually knows what the F-35 costs per hour to operate. And then there's the Ghost of Kiev. In the first days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in late February 2022, a story began circulating on Ukrainian social media of a lone MiG-29 pilot who had shot down somewhere between 6 and 40 Russian aircraft in the opening hours of the war, depending on which version you encountered. Photographs circulated, tribute videos were edited together, and Ukrainian government social media accounts amplified the story for weeks as a piece of morale-boosting wartime mythology. By April 2022, the Ukrainian Air Force itself had publicly confirmed that the Ghost of Kyiv was not a real individual pilot, but a composite myth, a symbolic figure representing the collective efforts of Ukrainian airmen in defense of the capital, or you might call propaganda. It was a useful story in a desperate moment. It was also a lie, but, for the greater good. Fighter jets, in short, are simultaneously deadly serious weapon systems, and somehow also action figures for adults, posters on teenage bedroom walls, the soundtrack of a stadium flyover, and the central characters of films that make $1.5 billion, which is, by any measure, a slightly complicated cultural position for a machine whose primary design purpose is to kill the pilot in the other one before he kills you. From a wooden propeller bolted to the nose of America's first fighter jet in 1942, to an algorithm flying an F-16 with a sitting government minister in the backseat in 2024, fighter aviation has spent the last 80 years compressing more change into a shorter span than almost any other field of human engineering. And the men and women strapped inside the cockpits have done most of the absorbing of that change with their own bodies, their own training, and, on more occasions than the brochures admit, their own lives. The aircraft are going to keep getting faster, smarter, stealthier, and more expensive. The formations will get stranger, with fewer humans and more machines, and somewhere, over a future battlefield, a pilot will look out at a wingman that has no pilot in it at all, and probably wonder whether the sky still belongs to him, or whether, like that wooden propeller, that part of the story has been a careful piece of misdirection all along. Thank you for watching.